It was the fall in a small farming town in Illinois. A family of 6 was winding down for the night and doing their normal routine for the next day. The kids were getting tucked into bed, and the parents were finishing up their chores. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but sadly, they would never see the sun come up. This case has been referred to as the bloodbath in B, and you'll know why soon enough. When you hear Illinois, you may quickly think of Chicago. It's a big city, and you probably imagine the hustle and bustle, the streets alive with activity, people rushing to work, tourists exploring the city, and locals enjoying the vibrant atmosphere, with the iconic L trains weaving through the cityscape. But chances are, you probably haven't heard of Beason, Illinois. It's a small town about 200 miles away from Chicago out in the central part of the state. B only has a population of about 200 people, very different from the over 2 million people living out in Chicago. It's a completely different experience. Beason is a rural area surrounded by farmland and rolling hills. It's quiet, it's a slower-paced kind of life. It's probably the smallest town I've talked about on this channel. Look, here it is on the map. That's it. They've got a post office and actually not much else. There's a strong sense of community there, and the town is known for its close-knit neighborhood. People are friendly and welcoming, and there's a strong sense of belonging. Neighbors know each other. It's a family-friendly environment. The town has a safe, family-oriented atmosphere, and residents prioritize raising their children in a wholesome and nurturing environment. The people who live in Beason tend to be more conservative, which is reflected in the town's politics, their religious beliefs, and their social norms. There's a lot of church-going individuals who seek out living in Beason because of the strong Christian presence there. Residents are likely to attend church regularly and hold very traditional religious values. It's small-town suburbia where life is sweet and the worries are few. This image of the picture-perfect America has been instilled in us by countless movies and TV shows. We think of small towns as being exempt from the turmoil and the chaos that engulfs the rest of the country. It's as though death and destruction wouldn't dare stain those white picket fences and quaint main streets. Maybe we feel a sense of safety in small towns because we think fewer people lived in the town, so it would be more difficult for people to hide their twisted desires. Or, the fewer the people, the less likely that a psychopath would be among them. But the reality is that even in the smallest communities with familiar faces, danger can be right beneath the surface. And when that danger finally reveals itself, there will be streams of blood that wash through the once picture-perfect town. And that is the story I'm telling you today. I want to introduce you to 2 families that called Beason, Illinois their home back in the late 90s. The Gee and the Constant families. Let's start with Rick Gee. He was known for his strong work ethic and determination. He's a hard-working man who initially worked for his stepfather's construction company in Lincoln, Illinois. That's the town that you would make a trip to if you needed anything. It's about 15 minutes away. That's where the schools are, the Walmart, the restaurants, and their tiny airport. There's more to do there, but it's not a huge town either, but much bigger than Beason. There are about 15,000 more residents in Lincoln. That's also where Rick's stepfather, William Clark, who everyone called Pudge, and his mother, Judy, lived. Rick's biological father, Raymond, died in Vietnam when Rick was only 5 years old. Eventually, after picking up contract work wherever he could and trying hard to save money for his and his daughter Nicole's future, Rick's dedication and perseverance finally paid off. He was able to purchase property at the edge of town in Beason. Instead of helping out at his stepdad Pudge's company, he opened up his own construction company, Gee Construction. He bought a ranch-style home with a 2-car detached garage and an above-ground pool and lots of farmland where he kept chickens, among other things. I don't know how many rooms were in this house, but at least a few, because in order to pay off his mortgage and bills, Rick decided to offer a room for rent to a woman named Ruth Constant and her 2 young children, 3-year-old Justina and 1-year-old Dylan. I mentioned Ruth in the beginning, and the Constant family is the other family I wanted to introduce you to. So initially, Ruth became Rick's tenant, but it didn't take long before there was chemistry between the 2 of them. Ruth was a loving woman who was very outgoing and funny, and friends close to her said she was a jokester. She was really good at making you smile. She loved and cared for people, especially her children. Rick was hardworking and gentle. He was giving and generous, and he was extremely loyal and devoted to his family and helping others. His aunt recalls that Rick was just the type of person who would take in anybody's kids, love them, and give them a home. Rick and Ruth were a perfect match, and eventually he asked Ruth out on a date on Valentine's Day. It was a memorable occasion that marked the beginning of their romantic journey together. So initially Ruth became Rick's tenant, but it didn't take long before there was chemistry between the two of them. Their relationship continued to flourish, and Ruth found out that she was pregnant. The couple then took the next step, and in 1997, they got married. At the time, Rick was 34 and Ruth was 27. Rick's biological daughter Nicole was 15, Ruth's daughter Justina was 4, and her son Dylan was 2. Soon, Ruth and Rick's baby boy Austin would be born, and they had a full house. As a matter of fact, even though they only had 4 kids in their blended family, their friends thought of them as the real-life Brady Bunch from the popular TV show back in the 70s, where a couple comes together with 3 kids of their own, making them a family of 8. The Gees were still a big family, and there were more children to come. While Rick worked to provide for his growing family, Ruth stayed home and cared for all the children. Just a year later, Rick and Ruth welcomed a second child, a baby girl, Jessica Lee Gee, and they were overjoyed. However, that joy quickly turned to sorrow because they discovered that little Jessica had tragically been born with a very severe neurological condition. It left her with disabilities, and she was confined to a wheelchair. This eventually required her to have around-the-clock care and be in a facility that could ensure her unique needs were met appropriately. It's very sad, and I just want to point out that this was a very, very hard decision for this family to make, and they did not take it lightly. As you can imagine, it's devastating, so please let's try to be loving and understanding. There wasn't anywhere in Beason where Jessica could receive the care that she needed, and the Gees could not afford it on their own. Therefore, she was relocated 50 miles away in Peoria, Illinois, and temporarily became a ward of the state. Now, Rick and Ruth did their best to overcome their heartache of losing their daughter. Rick continued to work to provide for his family, and Ruth took care of the home, which now had playground equipment out back for the kids to play on. The family were members of the Park Meadows Baptist Church in Lincoln, where they would gather together every Sunday. Dylan was known by his friends to be popular and very outspoken. On the other hand, Justina was described as a very quiet girl who took pleasure in listening to Bible stories shared by her friends from church. Friends said that despite being more of a homebody, Justina's younger brother, Austin, did love coming to church with her as he got older. The older kids were actually bused into Lincoln for school during the week, and over the years, the younger children would join them. Every morning, they would make the 4-minute walk to the tiny little post office in town and wait for the bus. The postmaster, Jody Duncan, who had been in the position since 1999, watched the Gees children grow up. First, Rick's daughter Nicole, then Ruth's older children, Justina and Dylan, and as the years went on, Austin began coming in as well. Over the years, the children would gather in the post office lobby, and Austin would sit on the floor finishing his homework because he said he was more awake in the morning, and it was easier for him to get it done then than after school. She said that these kids were great kids. They never gave her any problems. They were polite and well-behaved. Well, kind of, because Ruth's son Dylan began showing some signs of trouble beginning in kindergarten in the year 2000. He had a lot of energy, and that led to him acting out, which isn't that out of the ordinary for a young child. His teachers would frequently have to write reports about his behavior and give them to Rick and Ruth, and together they would try their hardest to come up with ways to work through it. That same year, Rick's daughter Nicole had actually turned 18, and she had been dating a local 21-year-old guy named Christopher Harris. The two of them were getting more serious, and eventually the couple decided to get married and move in together. They moved just 1 minute away, on the other side of the small town of Beason, staying very close to friends and family. Not too long after this, Nicole found out that she was pregnant, and she and Chris welcomed the Gee's first grandchild into the world, Alyssa Harris. Ruth and Rick were excited for the new arrival, and Nicole and Chris would frequently drop little Alyssa off with Ruth during the day while they went to work. Now Rick's parents, his stepdad Pudge, whom I mentioned earlier, and his mom Judy, also spent a lot of time helping with the kids, and now Nicole and her little family as well. There was a lot happening in both households, especially when it came to Dylan. Things hadn't exactly gotten better over the years. He was still acting out and had become even more aggressive. There wasn't much to do in that small town, and it seemed as though Dylan would release his energy and aggression in class. The closer he got to puberty, the worse his behavior became. The only thing that seemed to keep him calm was playing video games in his room by himself, which he started to do for hours when he wasn't in school. Ruth and Rick did their best, but with Ruth being alone a lot and Rick working so hard, it was difficult, especially since business was scarce, and Rick had to take all kinds of jobs all over to make ends meet. Then Ruth found out she was pregnant again and had a newborn baby in 2006 when Dylan was 11. It was a lot for this family. The Gee's final baby to complete their family was sweet little Tabitha Gee. Of course, the older children helped out as much as they could, but it seemed like no one could really control Dylan. By that time, Ruth had taken him to a physician, Dr. Philip Rossi, who diagnosed him with ADHD and began treating him with medication. This did seem to improve Dylan's behavior slightly, but it didn't stop him from acting out and even going beyond just horseplay at school. He started to play rough with the kids in the neighborhood and immerse himself in violent video games in complete darkness in his room all alone. Rick echoed the same sentiment to his mother, Judy, saying if they didn't get Dylan under control, they would all wake up dead one day. That sounds pretty serious. At this point, Dr. Rossi decided Dylan should go see a child psychiatrist, so Dylan met with a therapist named Olivia Minna for a psychological assessment to get that referral. However, Dylan wouldn't stay consistent with coming in for the evaluation period, so the therapist never actually referred him out to anyone. Instead, he continued to take his medication, but that also stopped around the end of 2007, and Dr. Rossi stopped seeing Dylan altogether by 2008. I wish I could say things got better for the Gee family, but they didn't. In 2009, Rick's construction work really began to decline, leading to financial struggles for his family. This definitely did not help, especially when it came to getting treatment for Dylan and the things he was dealing with. He became even more isolated. The 14-year-old was spending most of the day alone in his room, avoiding everyone, and still immersing himself in video games. However, he had started to get some of his energy out by helping Rick with construction jobs when he wasn't in school. Both 14-year-old Dylan and 11-year-old Austin attended Lincoln Junior High School in Lincoln, where Dylan wrestled for the Trojan wrestling team and was pretty popular with the girls. Even though he sometimes sported dark circles under his eyes from staying up late playing video games, his blue eyes still sparkled, and girls noticed that he was starting to go from a boy to a man. He would ride his bike throughout the town with his brother Austin, who was active in band and chorus. The two had friends who would join them as they tried to stay active and entertained in their small town. 16-year-old Justina attended Lincoln Community High School, and little 3-year-old Tabitha was in the early education program at the local preschool. That summer, Justina and Austin attended an area Bible club. Both children were attentive and polite, and Justina had just become a born-again Christian. In late July of that year, Nicole and Chris had their second baby, a little boy that I'm going to refer to as Charlie. Chris was working as a cook at the Steak and Shake in Lincoln while studying architecture at Lincoln College. He got all A's and B's and was hoping to get into that industry after he finished his courses. In his free time, he enjoyed taking his family boating on the area rivers and lakes. Nicole was taking care of little Charlie when he wasn't over at Ruth's, being cared for by her and Nicole's siblings. 9-year-old Alyssa was in school during the day. Ruth had even made a few very close friends over the years. One in particular, Natalie Clean, lived right next door. Natalie and her husband had 4 kids of their own. The couples would get together when they had time to hang out, especially when the kids would go to sleep at night. These people lived a very simple life. However, it was a very active summer for everyone. As it was coming to a close and the crisp fall air was moving in, replacing the hot, humid weather, the kids were going back to school, and a new year was right around the corner. That September, Rick, his stepdad Pudge, and one of Pudge's grandsons, Adam, were helping out at Nicole's house. They were installing new carpet. They probably needed it with a new baby that would be crawling in no time at all. Sadly, tragedy would strike this family and shake the small town of B to its core. It was after school on September 21st. 10-year-old Satan Landstrom, who was best friends with Dylan and Austin, was racing over to the G's home to show off his brand new bike. Once he got to the front porch, little Satan saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks and not run up to the G's front door. There was blood all over the porch and smears of blood on the door, which was open about a foot. Satan was scared. He didn't know what to do, so he just yelled out, "Is anyone home?" He didn't get a response, so he hopped on his bike and rode as fast as he could to Nicole's house, only a few blocks away, to get help. His face was as white as a ghost when he got there, and he encountered Pudge and Adam working on the house. As soon as he saw them, he shouted, "There's something wrong at Dylan's house. You better get down there." The urgency and fear in this little boy's voice made the men get up and immediately jump into Pudge's pickup truck and race over to the G's house. Adam was the first one to get to the porch, where he too saw the blood as well as a knife at the bottom of the porch steps. He relayed this information to Pudge, who was still back at the pickup truck, making his way up to the home. Pudge said that the family raised chickens, so maybe they were just butchering some of them. If only that were the case. As Adam carefully stepped past the blood on the porch and proceeded into the house through that open door, it was completely dark inside. He began feeling along the wall for a light switch as he called out Rick's name, followed by Austin's, but he got no answer. Then, when he was finally able to turn the lights on, that is when he caught the first glimpse of the absolute carnage inside that home. The light illuminated a scene that would haunt Adam for the rest of his life. Lying in the hallway was the lifeless body of Rick G., face down in a thick pool of blood. Adam was frozen in his tracks. He didn't dare go any further. He turned and ran outside to Pudge and told him to call 911. Though he didn't know what to tell the police as he wasn't inside to see it for himself, it was apparent by Adam's demeanor that it was serious. It was at that moment that Nicole, Rick's eldest daughter, pulled up at the G's house, wondering where her grandpa and cousin had gone and why they hadn't come back to the house yet. That's when she encountered Adam, Pudge, and Sean outside the house. She could tell that something was very wrong, and she begged them to tell her if her family was okay. They informed her that something had happened to her father, and the police were on their way. She was shocked and confused, and she begged Pudge to please go inside and make sure Ruth and the children were okay. She explained that her family was in there, including her 3-year-old sister, and she wanted to make sure they were okay. Following Nicole's urging, Pudge retraced Adam's steps up the porch and went inside the home on his own. With the lights on, his eyes took in more than Adam's had. There was blood everywhere, not just a huge puddle underneath the body of his stepson Rick, but spatter was up and down the walls and on the ceiling. It was the stuff of horror movies. It was actually worse. The reality of the scene in front of Pudge was more terrifying and more horrific than anything that could be created for a fictional story because this was his family. Pudge fell to his knees, and Adam took a hold of him and dragged him outside just as the police were pulling up. It had been 12 minutes since Pudge called 911. Logan County Sheriff's Corporal Michael Block and Illinois State Trooper Paul Hennessy made contact with everyone outside before proceeding into the house with their guns drawn. After crossing the threshold of the front door, they were greeted by a large pool of blood, about 2 to 3 feet wide, just like Austin and Pudge had witnessed. When they got closer, they could tell that Rick's head was demolished, his body beaten, yet they couldn't tell how he was killed. They assumed that he had been shot in the head with a shotgun due to just how much damage had been done. It was horrifying. They had never seen anything this gruesome, and they hadn't even made their way into the other bedrooms of this house. As they continued down the hallway, they could see damage to the walls of the house as though they had been punched and smashed in. Then, they were confronted with a second victim. 14-year-old Dylan, who was only wearing a pair of shorts, was lying lifeless on his right side, frozen in the fetal position right outside the entrance of the home's main bedroom. His wounds were worse than Rick's. He was badly beaten across his entire body, and his head looked like it was in the same condition as Rick's. Again, the officers assumed it had been caused by a shotgun. Blood was sprayed all over the ceilings and the walls, cast off from the horrible devastation that had happened in that home. Where were the other family members? It didn't take long to find out. As the officers entered the main bedroom, there was Ruth wearing her nightgown, lying on the floor. It was evident that the damage to her skull was very significant. Half of her head had caved in. It was unreal. It's just one after the other, and each one is as bad as the one before or worse. As they pushed on, they moved in the attached bathroom of that room. And that's where they found little 11-year-old Austin, dressed in only a pair of underwear, lying face down on the blood-smeared tile floor in that bathroom. It was obvious that this family was not expecting to be confronted by such evil. It appeared like they had been caught off guard while just getting ready for bed the night before. Bedrooms are supposed to be a safe place, but for the G family, they were a place of horror. The officers moved on, trying to clear the entire house, not knowing if the killer was still inside. They walked down that same bloody hallway where Dylan remained. They walked past him and continued down the hall to 16-year-old Justina's room. For many teenage girls, their room is where they spend time talking to their friends. It's their safe sanctuary. They pick out their next outfit, and in Justina's case, she would read her Bible in there. You'd expect to maybe see posters of her favorite band or actor hung up on the wall, but instead, there was more blood. It was smeared and seeping into every surface of the room, including the bed where Justina's lifeless body was found. She was on her bed, lying on her stomach, and what was left of her head was dangling over the side of the mattress above a puddle of brain matter. She seemed to have suffered the most brutal injuries out of anyone in the entire family. And unbelievably, the scene was about to get even worse. If it wasn't already horrific, there were simply no words to describe what came next. The baby, where was she? As they exited Justina's room, they went into an adjacent room. At first, they couldn't see any more victims, but then they spotted something on the floor of a dark closet. It was the sight of a 3-year-old's body crumpled on that floor in a pool of blood, with skin above her right ear peeled back. That broke these officers' hearts. Yes, they were professionals, but nothing can prepare you to see what those men saw that afternoon in the G's house. Especially such a young child, mercilessly beaten until no life was left in her. As they stood there in shock, looking at this whole scene, furniture broken, glass shattered, dents in the walls, they tried to imagine what type of struggle had occurred and who could have wanted this family destroyed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Corporal Michael Block saw something move. He could not believe it. Had he just seen baby Tabitha move? As he watched in shock, he saw it again. Tabitha was trying to lift her tiny arm. Michael shouted to Trooper Paul Hennessy, "Paul, she moved," and by some miracle the 3-year-old little girl was alive. Paul jumped into action. He quickly holstered his gun and rushed to the baby's side. He knelt down beside her and felt her back to make sure she was still breathing. He was going to check for a pulse, but in her condition, he didn't want to check her neck because he was afraid he would injure her. He quickly radioed for paramedics to get on the scene as fast as they could. Paul then turned his attention back to little Tabitha and asked her, "Honey, are you okay? Can you hear me?" She groaned in response. She truly was alive and responsive. She was clinging to life. Luckily, paramedics had already been notified before Paul's call, and they were waiting right outside to get the message that the house was clear and they could enter the scene. One of the paramedics ran inside, set their bag of equipment down, and immediately started to assess the scene. Paul let them know, "She's alive, and you need to get her out of here now." The paramedic just scooped her up like a baby in his arms and raced out the door to the ambulance. There was a glimmer of hope in the midst of all of this darkness. They hoped that Tabitha would survive, but the closest hospital with the capacity to save her life was over 50 miles away, an hour's drive from B. As the paramedic raced outside, Nicole realized that her baby sister was still alive. She was shocked and devastated by the sight of this tiny, battered body being carried out of the house. Nicole became hysterical. She wanted to run inside and be by her loved ones, not knowing how gruesome this scene was. Of course, officers had to hold her back. No matter how loud she screamed that her family was in there and that she wanted to see them, they ushered Nicole into the back of the ambulance, and it sped off towards the nearest hospital. But when they arrived there, they realized that Tabitha's vitals were not looking good. They picked up a nurse to assist them with the transport and life-flighted her to the Trauma 1 Hospital St. Francis Medical Center in Peoria, Illinois. By this time, word had traveled. Little Satan had raced over to a friend's house nearby, the home of Stormy Whitney, a friend of the G family. She was in the kitchen when Satan stormed in, screaming, "They're dead! They're dead! They're all dead!" Stormy was thinking that Satan was being just a little bit dramatic, especially for a 10-year-old. She looked over at him and told him, "Chill out, stop watching scary movies." She added, "No one is dead. This is B. Unless they're old, they're not dead." But then she walked outside, and that's when she saw a bunch of lights flashing in the direction of the G's home. At that moment, her phone started blowing up with text messages and calls. What happened? The town had never experienced anything like this, and everyone began gathering on their porches outside, trying to gain insight into what was going on. In their usually quiet little rural town, moments later, Nicole's husband, Chris, showed up at the G's house. Someone had called him from work and told him that something horrific had happened to his in-laws. Chris left his workplace and headed towards Rick and Ruth's. Upon his arrival, Chris was met by the police, who confirmed the heartbreaking truth of the murders. However, in the midst of the chaos and tragedy, there was hope. The police informed Chris that Tabitha, the 3-year-old, had miraculously survived and was on her way to the hospital with Nicole. Without a second thought, Chris jumped back in his truck and drove with urgency towards the trauma center where Tabitha was being rushed. This poor family, it's absolutely unbelievable what happened that day. B is not big enough to have a dedicated police force. Instead, they have to rely on the Logan County PD out in Lincoln. But they don't have to rely on them very often, since they don't have crimes like this. At that moment, the two first responders, Logan County Sheriff's Corporal Michael Block and Illinois State Trooper Paul Hennessy, were left with the task of walking through the crime scene, looking for clues to what happened inside the walls of the G's home until they could organize a task force. So the officers went back inside and began taking notes and examining the scene for clues. One thing they noted was that a computer had been taken from the home. However, it seemed like that would be extreme overkill for this to have been a mere robbery, and they knew there had to be more to this story. Now the coroner was on the scene, ready to transport the bodies. Each one needed to be officially identified and examined. You can't hide this much commotion in such a small town. It's not every day that they see a coroner's vehicle outside one of their neighbors' homes. Since Nicole was the only immediate family member that the police had contact with, they called her, informing her they needed someone close to the victims to go down to the coroner's office and make an identification. Nicole was not going to leave her sister's side, so she gave them her grandmother Judy's number. This is Rick's next of kin, and she hadn't been informed of the murders yet. Nicole called her to prepare her for what was to come. When Nicole made that call, she couldn't hold back her emotions. She had to let Judy know that her entire family was dead, with Tabitha in terrible condition and that she might not even make it. Through tears and sobbing, Nicole let Judy know the news and told her they needed her to go identify the bodies. When ending that call, she said, "Grammy, you're all I've got left now. Drive safe." Wow, how heartbreaking. This poor family. Of course, everyone was in total shock. It's hard enough to understand losing one person that you love so dearly, but all of them, all six, an entire family essentially wiped out in one night. It's unfathomable. Judy was given photographs of each victim, and she identified them in family photos. Each one, Rick, then Ruth, then Justina, Austin, Dylan, and of course, little Tabitha. I can't even begin to imagine the pain of having to see your loved ones in that condition. It's beyond me how these people are able to keep it together after so much emotional trauma. That night, Dr. John Ralston, a forensic pathologist, carried out the autopsies. He photographed every inch of the victims' bodies and categorized their injuries. But in this case, each of the victims' injuries were so numerous they overlapped one another, and it was hard to figure out how many individual injuries they had. One thing was for sure, they were brutal and intense, and they actually were not from a gun. I know that the first responders thought that they had been caused by a shotgun, but they weren't. Each member of the G family had been bludgeoned to death, which is so much worse because they suffered. With each blow, they got weaker and weaker, and each died from multiple blunt force trauma injuries. That night, the coroner made the call to the Logan County Sheriff's Office and spoke to Officer Stephen Nichols regarding the G's injuries. They were all badly beaten with a heavy object. The doctor said it was impossible to tell where one wound started or ended. Let's start with 46-year-old Rick G., the father. He had 39 impact wounds, with 13 of those to his head. His wife, 39-year-old Ruth, suffered 28 blows all over her head and body. Her skull was crushed from the force, and her face was indented over her right eye. 11-year-old Austin's skull was caved in on both sides, and it was determined that he was struck at least 21 times. There were also signs that he was forced into a hard object, like a counter or a bathtub, and that someone had stomped on his face. 14-year-old Dylan had over 100 wounds to his body and had been struck at least 52 times around his head and upper body. 16-year-old Justina had at least 15 identifiable injuries. As I had to explain, she was missing the entire top portion of her skull. The absolute brutality was undeniable. These people had been struck again and again, and the doctor stated that this repeated blunt force trauma completely crumbled their skulls like eggshells. It also looked as though both Dylan and his mother's bodies had been moved to different locations than the ones where they were killed. There were gouges on the walls and on a door, as if they had been struck by someone in those areas. But then the bodies were moved to a different location. It made sense that they placed them further back into the house. That night, the town was buzzing with rumors about who killed them and how. Before the G family murders, B was the kind of community where people never locked their doors. Neighbors would borrow things from each other without even asking, but on the 21st of September, all of that changed. In one short night, the veil of safety that had once covered this tiny town was shattered, and residents had to face the fact that someone in their community could be hiding a horrible secret. Residents began locking their doors at night and warned each other not to go outside in the dark. It's likely they started to look at their neighbors differently. After all, who knows what secrets they might be hiding? Marjorie Wright, another family friend and neighbor, was in disbelief when she heard the news. She said she just kept repeating, "No, it can't be that they're all gone." She couldn't get it into her brain that this horror was even possible. And remember Ruth's friend Natalie Clean, the neighbor who had 4 kids of her own? She couldn't understand why or who would do this. She couldn't comprehend it at all. She just cried and cried when she got the news. She said she just lost it. When Rick's mother, Judy, thought about what could have happened to her son and his family, one thing stuck out: the conversation she had with Rick about Dylan. Remember, Rick and Ruth had both been concerned for Dylan. Rick told Judy, if they don't get Dylan under control, they would all wake up dead one day. Had this come to fruition? Had there been a brutal massacre of the family by one of their own? People were wondering. Well, we know that Dylan had just as many, if not more, wounds to his own body, and the positioning of the bodies made it clear that this was not a murder and then someone taking their own life. Dylan could not have caused his own wounds, and there was no weapon left behind that matched the injuries. Rumors were already swirling, though. there were assumptions being made. It was the biggest mystery this town had ever had. The town was worried since no arrests had been made. After hours of searching around the G family home, a man named Dale Day, who lived a few blocks down from the G's, decided to arm himself. He said that the killer was still on the loose, and now he had his 9mm loaded, cocked, and ready to fire if someone were to break into his house. Residents who had never locked their doors before were considering it, not only just at night, but during the day. 14-year-old Brittany Fillmore, who knew both Dylan and Justina from high school, said, "Not many people locked their door here. Something like this isn't what you would expect, especially happening in a small town where everyone knows each other." 76-year-old Betty Posen felt the same way. She had lived in B since she was 6 years old and said that everyone got along and neighbors helped neighbors, but now no one felt safe. That night, Carol Coleman's, Rick G's aunt, had to find out about his murder through Facebook. Late Monday night, she logged on and saw a friend had posted something back at 8:30 p.m., just 4 hours after the bodies had been found, but before Rick and his family had officially been identified. Nothing had been announced by the police yet, but as soon as Carol saw that post, she raced over to Judy and Pudge's house to comfort them. That's a terrible way to find out this news, but maybe the people who did know were in such a state of shock they couldn't be calling everyone, having to repeat this horrific truth over and over again. By Tuesday morning, September 22nd, a day after the murders, the news media descended upon B, amplifying the collective anxiety and apprehension. Journalists and reporters swarmed this town, hungry for any information they could get on these heinous crimes. There were images and information about the victims and the grieving loved ones who were relentless in trying to search for clues. This was saturating the airwaves and the newspaper headlines. One article headline read, "Inside the home's walls, 6 people were bludgeoned at least 158 times." As the investigation unfolded, the community held its breath. They were desperate for answers and a resolution to this mystery. The fear was heavy in the air. It cast a dark shadow over the once peaceful town. Neighbors were eyeing each other, wondering if the killer could be someone they had known for years. Trust and security, once taken for granted, were now shattered. Investigators knew they had to solve this case, and fast, before this entire community imploded with fear. But where could they even begin? Ruth was a stay-at-home mom, and Rick was a construction worker. They were simple people who stuck to themselves. The investigators did not have much to work with, but they started to ask neighbors if they had heard or seen anything unusual on the night the G family was murdered. A man named Tom Rono, who lives across the street from the G home, said he didn't hear a thing. Apparently he had slept right through the brutal massacre just yards away. Tom said he had lived there for over 33 years and never locked his door before this. But now he was, even during the day. Tom told the authorities that he considered the G's good people. They kept to themselves, and he never really got to know them very well. But the yard was always neat, and they were quiet. Then Natalie Clean came forward and provided a lot of information that really helped piece together a timeline for the police. The kids had been seen at church on Sunday, but they had not made it to school on Monday morning. The family was found after 4 p.m. that day. Natalie said that she knew what the G's were doing on Sunday night because she was talking to both Ruth and Rick all night through Messenger on their computers. Natalie was partially deaf and relied on in-person communication to read lips and sign language, so it was much easier for her to communicate over text and Messenger than to talk on the phone. She regularly sent messages back and forth to the G's. Nothing was different about that night. She began chatting with them on Messenger around 10 p.m. until the early morning hours when the messages just stopped. Realizing the significance of this, detectives understood they needed to question Natalie and fast. She cooperated with the detectives and provided her statement. Natalie explained that Justina, Austin, and Tabitha were in bed when she began chatting with Ruth. Ruth and Rick would take turns responding to Natalie. They were making plans for Natalie to come over and smoke some pot with them. Natalie was just waiting for her 4 kids to go to bed, But she was having a little more trouble that night because her husband, who was usually in town to help out, wasn't there. Natalie recalls Rick telling her that Dylan was still awake, playing video games in his room. Here are some of the messages. "Got 3 down and 1 to go," Natalie wrote in a message to Ruth, which was answered by Rick at 10:21 p.m. with, "Won't be long here now." A couple of hours went by, and Natalie hadn't heard back, so she messaged, "Damn, I'm starving LOL, and there's nothing to eat in this house." 5 minutes later, she got a response from Rick saying, "That sucks when that happens." That was the last time Natalie ever heard from the G's. She responded with, "Yes, it does," at 1:04 a.m., but received no reply. It wasn't like them to make plans with her and then just ghost her. She pinged them once again, saying that if she didn't stop smoking marijuana, she would end up eating some weird foods and weird combinations. Still no response. At 1:45 a.m., she ironically typed, "You still alive over there?" The timeline provided by these messages was very important. Investigators could now ask people who lived nearby if they saw anything or anyone between around midnight and 2 a.m. However, after questioning, none of the neighbors could provide information on what the killer might have looked like. They hadn't seen anyone in the area that night. One neighbor did remember something. He said that around midnight, while smoking a cigarette on his porch, he noticed an unfamiliar truck passing by. He heard the sound of the vehicle barreling down the road, and because of the time of night, it piqued his interest. The truck was heading toward the G family home. He looked out of his window and saw what appeared to be a silver or gray pickup truck with very unusual exhaust pipes. He expected the vehicle to continue through town, but it didn't leave. He couldn't tell where it went after that. The truck was described as a Chevrolet S10 or Ford Ranger type vehicle with gray primer and chrome exhaust pipes coming out of the bed. The color of the truck was not a factory paint job. Police acted on this seemingly small clue immediately. They decided to pull over any vehicle that matched the description. This was only a town of about 200 residents, so how many silver or gray trucks could there really be? But it turned out there were plenty, and this effort did not provide any new leads. They brought in a sketch artist to create a composite drawing based on the neighbor's description, which was released to the public. Following the release of the drawing, leads began pouring in from as far away as Washington, D.C. The detectives pursued each lead, hoping to uncover vital information. But despite their efforts, none of these tips panned out. As for 3-year-old Tabitha, let me update you on what transpired at the hospital in Peoria. Little Tabitha, still wearing her blood-soaked t-shirt with the word "smile" on it, was lying in a hospital bed with a gaping hole in the front of her forehead and a large gash around her ear. These were massive injuries, and the doctors feared she could have brain damage, especially since she hadn't spoken to anyone yet, but this poor little girl. She was terrified. She had somehow survived hours upon hours by herself in a dark closet, clinging to life. They weren't sure if she wasn't speaking because she had a brain injury or if she just wasn't ready yet. She was immediately taken into surgery, where doctors had to cut into her skull, remove an entire section, and then replace it later, so they could allow her brain to swell without causing more damage internally. She also had a broken arm, which most likely happened because she tried to block the blows from this killer by raising her little arm. How sad is that? Nicole and Chris stayed by this little girl's bedside the entire time. They were shaken and devastated. Cops were also standing guard in front of Tabitha's room to protect her. They made sure to screen each and every person that came and went. She truly was their only surviving witness, and it wasn't even clear if she was going to make it. Everyone was wondering if she was going to retain any memory of such a traumatic event. This is unreal. I cannot believe that she was lying there, they said, for 14 hours or more, and she somehow survived. But now, let's quickly go back to the investigation. Police couldn't do much with the information about this pickup truck, so they filed the information away and got to work gathering evidence at the scene. Thankfully for investigators, the crime scene was a treasure trove of forensic information. It won't come as a surprise that it's pretty difficult to bludgeon 6 people, 5 having died, without leaving any forensic evidence behind. When crime scene investigators arrived, they pulled up to a home with neatly cut grass. It was well maintained. It had a white minivan still parked outside, a couple of bikes leaning against the detached garage, and an RV right next to it. There were toys scattered outside in the driveway. It looked like every other house on the block from the outside, but when they got inside, it was a different story. It would be impossible for me to explain just how horrifying the scene was. When I tell you there was blood on every wall, trailing through the entire house, just imagine 5 people, essentially 6, bleeding out, and how much blood loss that would be. It was a river of blood. They called it a bloodbath. With how many blows each person sustained, there were streams and sprays of blood across the furniture, the ceilings, everything. As they continued to comb the scene, they saw a bloody handprint located on the countertop in the bathroom, where little Austin's body was found. Technicians were incredibly careful to preserve that particular piece of evidence, and it was entered into the database in hopes of a perfect match. Now, I learned something. I am still in school for death investigation. I know I haven't talked about it in a while, but there are 2 types of surfaces, porous and non-porous. So a porous surface would be a piece of paper, let's say. And it's actually easier for people to lift a print or get a match on something like a porous surface, like paper, or maybe even a cloth, but something like glass, a bathtub, or something porcelain that doesn't absorb the blood, it's actually much harder to pull a print from those types of surfaces. I just thought I would mention it. I like to just do a little teachable moment in some of these videos, but they were hoping that they would get a match here. Then outside the residence, the investigators encountered another piece of evidence. In the dirt near the home, they discovered a very distinctive and clear shoe print impression. It appeared to match a K-Swiss tennis shoe. Despite these promising leads, the police faced a very frustrating dilemma. They didn't have any suspects, so they couldn't compare a handprint or a shoe impression. Although the detectives had no possible suspects, they refused to let that deter them and began diving into the theories to try to uncover the truth. Given the crime's violence, they were assuming this perpetrator must have also sustained injuries during this act. In an effort to gather leads, the detectives decided to reach out to the public. They told them to be on the lookout for anyone with unexplained wounds on their body, especially to their head and upper body. These could include cuts, bruises, lacerations, contusions, abrasions, even loss of hair from it being pulled out during the struggle. They went with this theory because there was a lot of blood outside of the house, even though all the bodies were found inside the house. It also still had to be tested, but the police left no stone unturned. They went and meticulously checked every hospital within a 200-mile radius. They were hoping that someone there would have been admitted with a lot of injuries that they could connect to the crime. But even with all of their efforts, they didn't find any concrete leads. While this investigation was going on, Nicole was left to face her world-shattering grief. Picking up the pieces does not adequately describe how immense this was for her and what a long journey she had ahead of her. Nicole was the only family member left unharmed, but of course she didn't live in the household. But she knew her family better than anyone else, so the investigators were very eager to talk to her when Tabitha was finally stable, following her surgery and resting comfortably. It was time for Nicole to speak with authorities. Even though Nicole had an alibi for the night of the murder, she was working. They still had to do their due diligence and thoroughly question her. They do this with anyone who's close to the victims. Of course, it was hard for Nicole to compose herself. She clung to Chris, sobbing in utter disbelief. But she knew she had to provide as much information as she could, so she pulled herself together. She talked to them about everything: who her family was, who her family's friends were, and who was close to them. She couldn't think of anyone who would have a reason to harm them. Nicole had recently finished her associate degree at Lincoln College in the spring. She was the mother to her and Chris's 8-year-old son and their 9-year-old daughter. So now they turned their attention to Chris Harris. He had been in Nicole and the G's life since Nicole was 15, so he could provide a lot of information about the family dynamic as well. They dated as teenagers and then got married, But of course, it wasn't all rainbows and butterflies. As it turned out, Chris and Nicole actually officially got divorced 3 years before this, in 2006. However, they had been back and forth at least a dozen times. When Nicole got pregnant the year before, Chris started coming around more and more. They were back together and trying to make it work again. He had actually been living out in Armington with his 22-year-old brother, Jason Harris, and his girlfriend, Jennifer Ernest, and their young children. This was about 20 miles away, and he had been living there ever since the official breakup in 2006. The investigators asked him the same questions. Where was he on the night of the murders? He told them he and his brother Jason were at a bar on Sunday night at midnight in the small town of Lale, which is about 20 minutes from B. They confirmed this with Jason and didn't actually think Nicole or Chris had anything to do with the murders, but they had to check everyone. Besides, neither one of them had any marks on their bodies, no wounds, so they were not suspects. 48 hours after the G family was found bludgeoned to death, the investigators were no closer to solving this crime. It's September 23rd. Little Tabitha is stable with her grandma Judy, Nicole, and Chris by her side. They don't know how long it will be until Tabitha will be able to talk to investigators. There's always an officer by her side, watching, listening to all the visitors' conversations, and keeping an eye out. The family was slow to lay the G's to rest because they were all spending as much time as possible making sure Tabitha was going to be okay. But just over a week after the murders, on the 28th of September, Nicole finally said goodbye to her 5 family members. Hundreds of people gathered to pay their respects, many of them holding on to white memorial pamphlets with a picture of the family on the front. It read, "In loving memory of the G and Constant family." The picture shows Rick G at the top center, Justina Constant to his top right, Austin G top left, and Dylan Constant on the bottom left with bright, shiny blonde hair. There's also Jessica G, the G's daughter who suffered from a brain injury at birth, at the bottom center. This picture is old, back when she was still under the G's care. There is Ruth Constant G with her daughter Tabitha as an infant in the bottom right of the picture. Underneath it, all their names are organized from the longest to the shortest. It's heartbreaking to think that they're all gone, except for little Tabitha and Jessica. The Family Life Center was filled with even more pictures of the family. They lined both walls of the room. A slideshow was playing while family and friends spoke about their loved ones that were gone too soon. Surprisingly, there was an open casket at the front of the room. Rick G was inside, and next to him were 2 tables on either side with 2 green urns on each of them, containing the cremated remains of the rest of the victims. Rick was the only one whose upper body and face could be viewed without extreme damage. The rest were too badly harmed. The G family was later buried in Lyanna Cemetery in Chest. Nicole was supported by her husband Chris, who had been her rock since the moment the news of this murder had been given to her. Chris and Nicole visited Tabitha every day. After all, she was Nicole's only surviving sibling, aside from Jessica, who was still in a care facility at this point. More than a dozen law enforcement officers from various police agencies, including the FBI, were involved in this investigation. Including the FBI, on the 30th of September, 2 days after the funeral, Nicole and Chris were leaving Tabitha's hospital room when something strange happened. One of the officers stationed outside Tabitha's room noticed something, a pair of K-Swiss shoes. At first glance, there was nothing out of the ordinary about this observation, as many people own this particular brand of tennis shoes. But what was strange about this instance was that not only had police linked the shoe print outside the G's home to that specific brand, but the person wearing the shoes was none other than Christopher Harris. Nicole G's supportive husband, Chris, had been Nicole's biggest support since the deaths. He was there during the difficult funeral when she had to say goodbye to her loved ones. He was there while she stood over her baby sister's body as it was hooked up to tubes, fighting for her life. He was everything a husband should have been in those moments. But as his sneakers squeaked against the stark white hospital floors, this observant officer felt the need to relay this information to investigators. Here's the thing. Chris is no stranger to the G family or their residence. His children both play and are cared for there, so he's bound to have left shoe prints outside. But it still piqued the officer's interest, so he reported it. They had already checked Chris out, but just to be safe, they dug deeper into who Chris was and his past, especially any criminal history. They found out that Christopher Harris was convicted of felony theft back in 1999 and had previously been convicted for shoplifting, writing a bad check, and possessing marijuana. But these charges and the conviction were a whole decade before these murders, and that was his last arrest on record, aside from some traffic tickets. They then took a look at Chris and Nicole's divorce file. There are only so many reasons for why you might want to file for divorce. Nicole's was cited as mental cruelty. However, she made a comment on the divorce application in her own handwriting in the side margin, where she wrote some physical cruelty, but she did not go into detail. This isn't much to go on because relationships can get very ugly. We know this, and many times partners will report whatever they can to get their divorce finalized. I'm not saying it's right. Clearly, Nicole felt safe enough to have Chris around, take him back years later, and have yet another child with him. Still, they called him into the station to ask him a few questions and get a good look at his case with sneakers. They seized the sneakers and compared them to the cement casting they took from the scene. Meanwhile, as his truck sat outside, the officers went to take a look. Now, he does drive a pickup truck, which is not too uncommon, and it's also light gray. But it's not just light gray, it's primer colored, and that is not as common. It is similar to the make and model that they're looking for. The thing is, it doesn't have those weird chrome exhaust pipes coming out of the back, but the investigators know those could easily have been sawed off. On the other hand, Chris's shoes were a closer match, but they still weren't exact, and they didn't have blood or dirt on them. They were the same brand and the same style as the ones from the print at the scene, but there was a discrepancy. They were about a size and a half too big. While they had him there, he willingly provided them with fingerprints and palm prints, which were sent to the crime lab for analysis. Then they sent Chris on his way. He definitely felt like he was being targeted, and it didn't sit right with him or Nicole. Clearly, he drove that car. He drove all around town. His car had been parked at Nicole's. Could this neighbor have seen his truck and just described it, even if it wasn't an exact match? Anyway, the town was getting anxious. They wanted answers. There were so many rumors going around, from the murders being a satanic ritual to Rick G committing it himself, maybe that he was beaten in the process by one of his family members and then succumbed to his wounds, but not before he killed everyone else. Some people theorized a crazed killer came into the town and struck the first house they saw, because the G's did live in the very first house on the north side of town. But investigators had a hunch it was much more personal. They just had to prove it. Now, on the same day, September 30th, 10 days after the murders, an employee from a place called Dixie Travel Plaza in Malee, named Tina Ketz, who was the general manager, had some information she thought would be relevant. She said that Chris Harris, Nicole's once ex-husband, now back with her, used to be employed by their company, but had left the job back in June. However, some of the employees recalled that he drove a gray primered truck, and Tina thought she should call in and let them know. Tina added that, the employees were kind of divided on whether it was really Chris's truck, since he didn't have those telltale exhaust pipes. But since it was the only one they knew with that aftermarket gray paint, they figured it was better to be safe and call in the tip. Investigators had already looked into this and thought they had been all wrong about even having suspicions about Chris. But they wanted to explore this angle down to every last detail possible, and that meant searching his home and his car. That wasn't a problem. Chris willingly gave the police permission to carry out the search at his last known residence, his brother Jason Harris's house. They didn't even need a warrant. It was only when the police went to search Chris's truck that they noticed something. In the bed of the pickup truck, underneath a tarp, they located the G's missing laptop computer. Not only that, but as they walked to the back of Jason's house, they discovered a chrome weight rack used for exercise, lifting weights. It was tucked behind a shed, and they could tell it hadn't been there very long. Interestingly, when they picked it up and put it inside the back of the pickup truck, it gave off the illusion of chrome exhaust pipes. The match was matching, but this still wouldn't be enough to prove that Chris murdered anyone. A matching truck, similar shoes, a laptop he could have borrowed, and a weight rack. This was more than they had on anyone else. But the investigators knew they needed something solid, something that would unequivocally place Chris at the scene of the crime that night. They wouldn't have to wait long for their slam-dunk piece of evidence. It all goes back to that bloody handprint I mentioned earlier. After careful analysis, it was determined that the handprint found at the crime scene belonged to none other than Christopher Harris. On October 1st, officers made their arrest and charged Chris with 5 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The town you would think would be relieved, but they weren't. Instead, they were outraged, many of them echoing the same sentiment. You've got the wrong guy. Why? People just could not believe that Chris would murder his own family, essentially. For what? The only thing that had been taken from the G's house was supposedly a laptop. Surely there would have been an easier way for Chris to get his hands on something like a laptop without murdering 5 people and trying to kill a child. He was a father, close to this family. Chris could and would not have done this. There was just no way. One of the people convinced of his innocence was, of course, Nicole. She wasn't having it. She publicly defended Chris at any chance she got. She quickly took to MySpace and wrote a post that read, "All this is such a mess, and it's not right at all. Now not only have my children lost 5 very close family members, but their daddy is being set up and taken away. This is too much." Nicole was livid and went on to write, "There is hard, solid evidence of all 6 of them fighting for their lives, and Chris had not even the slightest nick on his body anywhere. He has been by our side through all of this in every possible way, and now they took him from us too. He's not a violent person. He couldn't bear to gut a fish for frying. They have the wrong man." Nicole wasn't the only person in Chris's life to stand up for him and against his arrest. His stepmother, Debbie Harris, told the media that their family believed he was innocent. His father, Ed, was in tears as he spoke to Chris from jail. Debbie said that Chris was shocked to have been arrested and was fearful for his own family. He said, "Dad, I'm scared because I know the killers are out there." He swore to his family that he did not do this. Because investigators were made aware of Nicole's MySpace, they were able to locate Chris's profile as well and took a look through his posts, thinking it might offer some clues to his mindset leading up to the murders. On March 31st of that year, 2009, Chris posted, "Made up with Nicole. We're having a son." Chris also described himself in his bio as a carpenter by trade, but enrolled at Lincoln College. He wrote back in April that he had gotten a scholarship to attend, and that when he finished, he would have a bachelor's in construction management and a master's in architecture. Only 5 years to go, LOL. Chris described his other hobbies as hunting, riding ATVs, and motorcycles. In his last post on MySpace, dated September 18th, just days before the murders, Chris wrote, "Chris is happy to be free of negativity." And on the same day, he posted, "Free at last." When Chris was booked, they took pictures of his entire body. It's true he didn't have any marks on him, but what he did have was a big blister on the palm of his right hand. Guess what? A tire iron was found in a grassy area near a creek right next to Jason's house, where they were still conducting an investigation. When they seized Chris's truck on October 2nd, they realized it belonged to a 24-year-old girl named Jennifer Ernest, Jason's girlfriend and mother of his children. She was interviewed by police and was adamant that Chris was innocent. She and her mom, Sarah Duncan, had already provided alibis for both Chris and Jason on the night of the murders. But now, as things were unfolding, the investigators realized that this information had to be false. In another shocking move, they arrested Jason, Jennifer, and her mother Sarah for obstruction of justice. You may wonder how they knew that these alibis were false. At first, it was the simple fact that they knew Chris was at the scene due to his palm print being present, and his brother was last seen with him not too long before the murders at Lala Bar. But there was more. A woman named Lori Cole came forward. She worked as an armed security guard by day and said she encountered both Chris and his brother at her house in Lala at around 11:35 p.m. on Sunday night. She said she got a random knock at her door and she wasn't expecting anyone. She told investigators, "I opened up the door and I'm like, yeah?" There was a stranger standing on her porch with short blonde hair, wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans. He told her he came there to party. When she looked past the man, Lori said she saw the front end of a Ford Ranger pickup truck. She recognized the model because she had one herself. She explained to investigators that in this small rural community, at 11:35 at night, you wouldn't expect people to be knocking on your door asking if you want to party. The man kept insisting that he knew her from Lale Tap House, the bar he was just at 4 blocks away. But Lori hadn't been there in 20 years. He would not leave her alone. He was kind of looking at her and saying, "Come on, don't you want to do a line of cocaine?" Finally, she told him in a very serious tone, "Sir, I'm an armed security guard. I need to go to bed so I can get up for work tomorrow." Lori figured he had already been partying and didn't want the night to end. He finally did leave, and investigators know that this area is only a short 15 to 20-minute drive from the G's residence. Another woman, Christy Moore, came forward. She told investigators that she and Chris were on-again, off-again lovers. She used to be his girlfriend and had received a call from him late on Sunday. She was too busy with her kids to meet up for what she knew he wanted, which was sex. However, she didn't hesitate to take him up on the offer hours later after her kids went to school on Monday morning. Chris arrived at her house in Clinton, just a 15-minute drive from B, 12 hours after the murders. They slept together, and she said Chris was acting completely normal after the sex was over. Christy took selfies of them in bed. They were kissing, giving each other loving looks, and Chris was even smiling in some of the pictures. This didn't look like a man who had just slaughtered an entire family. When asked if she noticed anything unusual about him, there were no marks on his body in the pictures, and she said no. He was the same as he always had been, except she hadn't seen him in the past 2 months. I'm sitting here thinking that's because he just had a baby with Nicole exactly 2 months ago, so he's probably been busy with that. From the moment Chris was accused, he professed his innocence and denied any involvement in the crime. When confronted with the fingerprint evidence, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and got an attorney. At this point, it looked like he would let the law take its course and wait for his day in court. No one would get any answers until then. What he didn't account for was that while one Harris brother was keeping tight-lipped, the other was starting to feel the mounting pressure. As the investigation progressed, the charges against Jason were upgraded from obstruction of justice to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, matching his brother's charges. Now, Jason was facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars, all for something that his brother might have done. Jason had a choice to make: either keep his mouth shut and back his brother up, or save himself and tell the truth. Thankfully, there's nothing quite like that innate human instinct to protect yourself. Jason began to talk, and the story he told sent shivers down even the most seasoned investigators' backs. According to Jason, the story started right where many bad decisions begin, with drugs and alcohol. He and Chris had been out that night, partying hard, drinking, and snorting cocaine. At some point, the two brothers decided they needed the company of a lady to really take their fun to the next level. At first, they tried to catch the attention of 2 women they knew, some of their ex-girlfriends, but neither of these women was interested and turned them down. This is where the night should have ended, but we all know it didn't. The haze of the drugs, coupled with Chris's intense libido, apparently steered the night into a direction that would end in tragedy. Chris and Jason decided they would make their way to another lady's house nearby. We heard from her, Lori, the armed security guard who turned them away. Jason said he waited in the truck while Chris went up to her door. Now, here's where things get a little fuzzy, as Jason told about 13 different versions of the next series of events. I'm not going to tell you each and every detail, but one thing remained constant. He claimed his brother Chris killed the G family. According to Jason, it was Chris's idea to make their way to the G's residence and attempt to have sex with Justina, the G's 16-year-old daughter. And let's not forget, she's also Chris's sister-in-law. Apparently, Chris told Jason that he thought Justina had been flirting with him, giving him the eyes like she wanted more. It's unclear at this point whether the brothers intended for this to be a non-consensual act, or whether they genuinely believed that Justina was actually going to have sex with them. Either way, their plan was in motion, and the brothers headed over to the G's residence. Jason says he doesn't really know what happened inside the house because he stayed in the car the entire time. Chris walked up to the front door. In some accounts, Jason said he was already armed with the tire iron, while in other versions, he just went up and knocked on the door without it. In that version, Rick met him at the door and they talked, but it seemed like the conversation went in a bad direction. Soon, Chris was running back to the truck to grab the tire iron. Then he entered the G's home, and Jason said he heard thumps and screams coming from inside. However, in the version where Chris went inside with the tire iron, it's unclear whether he stormed in, let himself in, or was let in by someone. Jason said that after some time, he heard what sounded like a bowling ball hitting the ground, followed by a woman screaming. Then Jason saw a figure burst headfirst out of Justina's bedroom window. It was Dylan. Jason said Dylan ran into the driveway and yelled, "Baba! Baba!" That's Jason's nickname. But Jason just sat there frozen in shock and didn't respond. Instead of running away, the 14-year-old boy ran straight back inside, where Jason could hear a woman screaming. Not long after, Dylan came back out of the house again, this time bleeding profusely and running toward the backyard. Jason saw Chris with a tire iron in his hand, chasing behind him. Jason said he saw his brother hit Dylan at least 5 or 6 times while Dylan kept screaming, "Chris, stop! Chris, stop!" Jason made it seem as though all of this was happening because Chris was laser-focused on his single-minded goal of having sex with his teenage sister-in-law, and that number 14-year-old boy was going to stand in his way. Jason said Dylan wasn't dead. He was severely injured and bleeding heavily. However, once again, Dylan chose not to run away. Instead, he went back inside and didn't survive after many long and horrific minutes. Chris walked out of the house, jumped into the truck holding the tire iron and a laptop computer. He was worried that the web camera had captured the event and didn't want to leave any witnesses. As the brothers drove away from the G's home, Chris threw his blood-soaked shoes out the car window, along with the tire iron. With Jason's help, they were able to locate those bloody shoes. Jason said Chris made him burn the rest of his clothing, and then Chris purchased a brand new pair of sneakers, a size and a half bigger. The next day, in exchange for a reduced sentence of 20 years in prison, Jason agreed to testify against Chris. The trial was wild. It happened in 2013, about 3 years after the murders, and there was so much that went on. I'm not going to tell you all of it. I will summarize it for you because Chris had a story of his own. He had a defense. Self-defense. And it's not much of a stretch, so I'll start there. Tell me what you think. Chris's version of what happened that night starts out very similarly to what his brother said. They were partying and drinking at a bar, and then when they left, they stopped and got some beers, did some cocaine, a lot of it actually, and then called and texted some females to meet up with. Unfortunately, none of those women wanted to hang out. Before heading back home, Chris wanted to stop and get some marijuana from Rick. You already know that on that same night, Rick was planning to smoke with Ruth and the neighbor Natalie. So we can assume he did have marijuana on him. Whether he sold it to other people can't be determined from what I gathered. Nevertheless, Chris said he drove over, went up to the door, and went inside because he was part of the family. When he opened the door, he saw what he thought was Rick sleeping on the floor of the living room. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized Rick was hurt. He continued down the hall and looked into the primary bedroom. That's when he saw Ruth dead in a pool of blood. Chris then made his way to Justina's bedroom and saw her on the bed, deceased. At that point, he heard something. The floor creaked behind him. He turned around and was confronted by 14-year-old Dylan in a violent rage, raising a knife over his head and trying to attack Chris. Chris said he had no choice but to step in and stop him. They got into a struggle, and Dylan escaped through Justina's window. Recall that there was a knife found on the front porch. Chris said he chased after Dylan, grabbed the tire iron, and began to use it on him until he thought he had him subdued. Then he went back inside to check on the family. Dylan was back inside, trying to attack him again, at which point Chris was forced to kill the troubled teenager in self-defense. Chris said he was in total shock. He never came forward because he wanted it all to disappear. He never wanted to have to tell his wife what he saw, what he witnessed that night. He then covered up what happened in the hope that no one would ever know the truth about what Dylan had done. He didn't want the family to have a bad reputation in town. Also, the blood outside did belong to Dylan, and investigators initially thought that it was from the perpetrator. That's why they were looking for someone who was hurt. So, could Chris be telling the truth? Chris had two defense attorneys, Peter Naylor and Daniel Folds, who offered evidence to back up Chris's claims. There was testimony from a professor at Iowa State University who claimed that Dylan had a long history of antisocial behavior. He had poor performance in school, a below-average IQ, and the defense also pointed out the fact that Dylan came from what they called a broken home, since Ruth had left his biological father before she married Rick. Dylan never fully adjusted to this new blended family and never considered Rick his father. Therefore, he was continuously defiant. Not only that, but he constantly isolated himself and played violent video games, which could have fueled him to hurt people in real life. He was diagnosed with ADHD, and the defense pointed out that some drugs for ADHD can cause violence and irritability. However, Assistant Attorney General Steve Nate argued that Dylan hadn't been on medication for the last 2 years. This was used by the defense as another argument that Dylan needed care and that the G's were in poverty and unable to provide him with sufficient treatment and counseling. The defense subpoenaed all of Dylan's school disciplinary records for the past 3 years, which showed approximately 250 incidents in those years alone. He was written up for everything from minor issues to more serious ones, such as throwing rocks, kicking someone in the crotch, and even spraying Lysol on a classmate. He also slashed his seat on the bus with a stolen razor blade and was heard saying he couldn't wait until the stupid school blew up, which was after he didn't do well on a test. The police were actually called for other reports of him being physical with a student. He elbowed someone in the face hard enough to give them a bloody nose and break their glasses. He did have a propensity for becoming aggressive, and when he wasn't in school, he was aggressive toward members of his own family. The defense said they planned to have Chris's young daughter, Alyssa, who was 9 at the time Chris was arrested, but now 14, testify that she saw Dylan pull a knife on his younger brother, Austin. On another occasion, Dylan put Austin in a headlock while they were in the swimming pool and forced his head underwater repeatedly, enough that eyewitnesses thought he was trying to drown the boy. The judge, however, blocked the jury from hearing those statements. I told you about Rick and Ruth's statements about being afraid that Dylan might kill the whole family if he didn't get help. The statements contain no specific threat, so it was decided that they were made too long before the murders, and the jury shouldn't hear about them. But it was the DNA evidence in this case that was a big factor. It's truly hard to believe that someone can kill 5 people, almost 6, and not have one scratch on them. If it truly was Dylan, it would make sense that he was so injured, considering his family would have been fighting back at some point. Rick's DNA was actually found under Dylan's fingernails, but the prosecutor's expert witness said that was reasonable considering they lived in the same household together. However, Chris's DNA wasn't found at the scene. I don't know what it would have been like being on that jury, but they were put through a lot. There were pictures of the poor victims, and it was traumatizing. Some jurors had to turn their heads because it was so graphic. A blood spatter expert testified for the prosecution, saying that the killer's legs would have been sprayed with blood because of the location of the victims, especially in Justina's case, as she was lying hanging off the side of the bed. There was no blood spatter on Dylan's lower extremities. He was wearing shorts, and his legs were bare. The experts said whoever hit Justina would have had blood all over their lower extremities, so it didn't add up. There were only a few small spots of blood on the front of Dylan's legs, and Dylan had sustained so many injuries that it was illogical to believe he would have been able to continue killing his family. The injuries to all of his knuckles alone would have prevented him from being able to hold a tire iron. When prosecutors provided evidence and testimony from Dylan's actual teachers, they told a different story about the so-called troubled teen. One said he was a joy to have in class. Tamara Pagel, a special education teacher who teared up on the stand, said that Dylan just had a lot of energy. She said, quote, "I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Jackson, but Dylan was the kind of kid who would do the moonwalk on the way to the pencil sharpener." End quote. Lisa Howard, another teacher, testified that of course, Dylan ranked in the top 3 for disciplinary referrals, but the vast majority of them, according to her, were minor things like speaking up in class without raising his hand or pushing a notebook from his desk to the floor. Lisa said that when he became frustrated, all she had to do was have a talk with him. He was described as fun, loving, and brotherly toward his siblings, especially Tabitha, who was in their early education program. Lisa said that he doted on Tabitha like there was no tomorrow. Dylan's wrestling coach, Alex Dawson, even testified. He told the court that Dylan didn't have enough fight in him to be a great wrestler, but he had spirit and game. So much so that coaches chose Dylan as the team's most inspirational wrestler in his first season. Alex said, quote, "He was new to the sport and he didn't have the aggression that a lot of kids have." End quote. Dylan was described as a good listener and a fast learner, and he was never a problem at wrestling practice. Telephone records showed that Chris Harris borrowed a phone at the Lolly Bar at 11:18 p. the night of the killings. The call lasted about 10 minutes. Then witnesses say Chris and Jason finished their beers. We know they stopped at Laura's house, the armed security guard, just a few blocks from the bar. After that, they headed to B. The prosecutors estimate that the brothers would have gotten to B sometime before 12:30 in the morning. The last message from Rick came at 12:42 in the morning, so they argued he would have been alive when the Harris brothers got to that house. Then there was the state star witness, Jason Harris, who had pleaded guilty to perjury not too long ago. He was a liar through and through, and he admitted that. "I told you he had 13 different versions of what happened that night. The one he finally stuck with at trial was the one I told you about. Chris wanting to have sex with Justina, and that he took the tire iron with him when he went to the door. There, he encountered Rick, and there was an altercation, because Rick didn't want Chris talking to his teenage daughter. According to Jason, Chris already had that tire iron because he knew he would need it in case Justina fought back. But instead, he used it to kill her entire family in a drug-fueled rage, because in Jason's words, he didn't want to leave any witnesses. Jason admitted to burning the clothes, lying about the alibi, and hiding the laptop. The defense tried to negate all of this by showing a letter that Jason wrote to his brother when he was in jail. Everyone knew that Chris didn't do this, but now he's saying that he did. But it turns out that Jason wasn't the only one who gave a different perspective on the murders than what Chris was telling the court. A former cellmate of Chris's came forward, claiming that Chris had confessed to the entire murder. According to the cellmate, Chris told him the real story of what happened that night, and it was even more brutal than what Jason told them. Chris allegedly told his cellmate that when he arrived at the G home, Rick greeted him at the door, and he and Rick started to argue. That's when he struck Rick with the tire iron. Ruth heard the noise and went to figure out what was going on. When she walked into the room, he turned his vicious attack on her. At this point, Dylan managed to get a hold of a knife from the kitchen and attempted to come between Chris and Ruth. Chris managed to overpower Dylan, which is when Jason saw him crash through the window the first time. According to the cellmate, Chris told him that his only regret was that he didn't burn down the house that night. If he had, they would have never known it was him. Remember how Nicole was standing by Chris's side? Well, she was supposed to appear in court with her daughter Alyssa to testify, but they conveniently missed their flight from Florida, where they had moved following the murders. Nicole was supposed to tell the court that she talked to her dad, Rick, only days before the murders, and that Rick was scared that Dylan was going to retaliate violently because Rick had punished him for breaking down Rick's bedroom door and stealing money, and that he'd stolen drugs and pornography from him as well. Little Alyssa was going to testify that she heard Dylan say that he would kill his siblings, but this crucial testimony never came. After a month of hearing explicit testimony and graphic evidence from the investigation, it was time for the jury to make a decision. These men and women had to decide between two realities: whether they believed that a 14-year-old boy killed his family and was only stopped by the heroic actions of a drunken high man, or that a drunken high man who believed his own wants and needs were above the lives of innocent people had brutalized this family and then denied it, trying to blame it on a child. Ultimately, you probably guessed, Chris was found guilty of over 50 different counts of murder, attempted murder, home invasion, and robbery. 19-year-old Seth Jones, who was not only a neighbor of the G's, but also one of the jurors, said that the physical evidence against Chris was overwhelming. He said, quote, "It was tough. I honestly was looking through everything to find something to say that he wasn't guilty." End quote. It was the shoe print, the bloody shoes, the bloody handprints, and Chris's own actions in the days after the murders that resonated with the jurors. Seth also admitted he didn't even find any truth in Jason's testimony. On July 19, 2013, Chris had his sentencing hearing. Believe it or not, brave little Tabitha, who was now 7 years old, gave an impact statement. She said, quote, "I am 7 and it still breaks my heart. I wish you were dead and my brothers and sister and mommy and daddy were alive. You don't sneak up on other people. You have to say sorry because do you know how badly that broke my heart?" End quote. That made me tear up. Can you imagine all that this little girl has been through? In a powerful victim impact statement, Nicole, who once defended Chris, expressed her deep pain and loss. Nicole said, quote, "You are nothing to my babies or me. You're never getting out, so give it up. Remember, you had it all. No, you could have had it all. You are a mess up, and that is all you'll ever be." End quote. Rick G's mother stood before the courtroom, her eyes filled with sadness and determination. She held 2 victim impact statements, each representing a different facet of the tragedy that this family had to endure. As she began to read the first statement, her voice was shaking, but her resolve remained unshaken. The first statement was written from the perspective of Tabitha. She talked about how Tabitha had emerged from the darkness to thrive and build a life for herself, refusing to let the horrors she had witnessed define her. Then Rick's mom shifted her focus to her son and grandchildren. She spoke of their absence and the deep void in her life. In a final statement, she addressed Chris directly. She said, quote, "I pray you're dealt with the amount of mercy you showed my son and family." End quote. This was a plea for justice, a heartfelt plea for the pain inflicted upon her loved ones to be acknowledged and accounted for. On July 19, 2013, Christopher Harris was sentenced to 5 life sentences, which were to run consecutively, plus 30 years for attempted murder, 20 years for robbery, and 30 years for home invasion. Chris will never be free again. But during his sentencing, Chris spoke up. He said, quote, "I made a lot of stupid decisions that night, but I did not commit this crime." End quote. As for Jason, in return for testifying against his brother, he received a 10-year sentence with credit for time served. It's hard to say whether this was appropriate for someone who was essentially an accessory to a crime. There were so many moments where Jason could have changed the course of that horrible evening. So many times he could have walked up to Chris and ended this madness. So many times he could have done something. Dylan called out to Jason, begging him to do something, but he did nothing. On the other hand, his testimony secured justice for the G family. To wrap it up, Jason's girlfriend Jennifer and her mom were given probation and fines for their role in concealing evidence. And if you're wondering what happened to little Tabitha, remember those state troopers who were guarding her hospital door? They became her playmates over the 2 months she was recovering in that hospital. They did things like paint her toenails, read books to her, and play games. They pretty much treated her like their own daughter and even threw her a birthday party. She had to go through a number of surgeries, but miraculously, she made a full recovery. Fortunately, those head injuries actually prevented her from remembering anything from that horrific night when she lost her entire family. She did go into foster care at one point, but as time went on, she was eventually placed under the supervision of her sister Cole. In the aftermath of these murders, this community tried to heal and repair what had been lost. As part of the healing, the community dedicated a place to celebrate the life of the G family. They built a playground in honor of Austin, Dylan, and Justina. I want to end with something interesting that I found out. There was one further twist in the story. In 2014, apparently Investigation Discovery aired a show called When Murder Comes to Town. In this show, they claimed to provide viewers with an insight into the murders of the G family. I actually watched this episode. Despite interviewing many of the residents of B and even the officers involved in the investigation, the show focused heavily on Dylan and repeated the same story that the defense put forward during the trial. Even the reenactments of Dylan in the show gave viewers the impression that he was deeply troubled and a violent boy who was actually capable of killing his whole family. In response to Dylan's portrayal in this program, officers involved in the investigation wrote an open letter questioning the show's integrity and its need to call into question the reputation of a child homicide victim. The letter, which I will link in its entirety below, highlighted that Dylan was acting as a hero. It said in part, quote, "The graphic makeup utilized in the film by the actor portraying Dylan Constant was over the top, giving the appearance that Dylan was anything but a normal teenager." Interviews conducted during the investigation indicated that Dylan was like many teenagers who enjoyed playing video games. Information that would indicate he was violent towards his family or anyone else was never substantiated. As a matter of fact, Dylan did crawl out of a window and could have saved himself. Chris Harris followed Dylan and brutally beat him on the steps and porch outside the house. When Harris re-entered the home, Dylan followed him to help his family. Chris Harris then finally beat Dylan to death. The jury in the trial of Chris Harris rejected the defense's claims of self-defense and convicted Harris. The film was accurate in many ways, but to depict Dylan Connon as anything but a heroic teenage boy trying to save his family is a serious injustice to this youth and a drastic deviation from the facts." End quote. It happened in a small seaside town in Southern California. It happened to a vibrant, beautiful, and very well-known mother of 2 young boys. It happened in her own home without warning. Lives were ripped apart with no solid suspects until 40 years later. Today's case is another really heartbreaking one. Today I'm taking you to Los Angeles, California, specifically Southern California, to a beach town called Hermosa Beach. It's small, but it's not that small. The population was about 177,000 people back in the 1970s, but it really is a very close-knit coastal community. Not only that, it's more of an affluent community. The coastline in the South Bay includes places like Hermosa Beach and Manhattan Beach, which you've probably heard of before, because there are a lot of celebrities that live on the Strand. It's a beautiful stretch of beaches where the houses are literally hugging the sand of the shoreline. These are multi-million-dollar homes along the Strand. Lots of people enjoy running, walking, biking, etc. down these beautiful sidewalks. Hermosa Beach doesn't really look that different today than it did back in the 70s, which is the time frame we're going to be talking about. And this case is absolutely incredible. It was unsolved for 4 decades. In order to make our way to Hermosa Beach, California, we have to start with a love story. And that love story started out as a friendship between a small-town girl from Jackson County, Missouri, and an aspiring singer-songwriter from Santa Ana, California. Let me introduce you to Karen Sue O'Grady. She was born April 22, 1943, in Jackson County, Missouri. Karen's childhood was not easy. Her mom and dad did not get along, and her father would get physical. When she was just a young child, he decided to leave her, her brother, her sister, and her mom to fend for themselves. It was really hard on her mother, trying to make ends meet all by herself with the kids. Sadly, Over the years, things did not go well for Karen's siblings. Her brother ended up in prison, and her sister ended up in a psychiatric ward. But somehow, Karen overcame the struggles that she went through as a child, and she and her mom moved to Santa Ana, California, where she attended high school at Santa Ana High School. That is where and when she became best friends with a guy named William Thomas Medley. He went by Bill. Bill Medley was born September 19, 1940, in Santa Ana, California, to Arnold and Irma Medley. His mother and father were both in the music industry. His mom was a singer, and his father was a musician, and they had a swing band together. They were always introducing their son to music, starting at a very young age. Bill's parents were Presbyterian, and he regularly attended church, where he sang in the choir. Bill had a natural talent for singing, and his interest in music just kept growing and growing. By the time he was in high school, he already knew that he wanted to pursue a career in the music industry. Bill and Karen both attended Santa Ana High School and the church. Soon the stars collided, and they began a friendship, which did not turn romantic at the time, but it did blossom into a very deep friendship. Bill called Karen his best friend. Bill dreamed of being a singer-songwriter. He was way more interested in music than he was in school, so he decided to drop out of high school to see if the music thing could be more than just a hobby. Karen was 3 years younger, so she continued attending Santa Ana High School. Karen and Bill were living two completely different lifestyles, and by 19 years old, Bill was writing songs for bands and vocal groups out of his living room with his best friend, Don Fucci. Two of Bill's songs were recorded by the Diamonds, Womanling and Chimes of My Heart. But Bill dreamed of having his own successful singing group, so he and his best friend Don, who played the guitar, started playing music together, and they called themselves the Romancers. They gave it a go, and by 1960, nothing really stuck. Bill, being determined to make it big, tried again. He and Don decided to recruit a few other musicians, Sal Fulo, Nick Toro, and later Mike Ryder and Barry Riera. Now they had someone playing drums, bass, and other instruments to add to their sound, and they became known as the Paramore, and they were good. They actually ended up getting signed to a label called Smash Records, which was owned by a bigger company called Mercury Records. So, they were making it, and they released 2 hit songs, That's the Way We Love and Miss Social Climber, in 1961. Even though this seemed to be exactly what Bill dreamed of, there was just something missing. One of his bandmates, Barry, told him about a guy named Bobby Hatfield. Barry thought that Bill and Bobby would sound amazing together, so he told both of them they needed to check each other out, and this is when things came together for Bill. Initially, in 1962, the Paramore basically just asked Bobby to join their band, and he did. They released a single called There She Goes, She's Walking Away in December 1962 through an independent record label called Moonglow. But the band just wasn't feeling it. They didn't really like the new setup, and they broke up, leaving Bobby and Bill trying to decide what the heck they should do. Both of them were extremely talented singers, with Bill being an amazing songwriter, so instead of quitting, the two guys just said, "F it, we'll just sing together, just the two of us." In 1963, they began booking shows at venues without a name. They were just going by Bobby Hatfield and Bill Medley, until one night they were performing for a group of Marines. Back then, when something was cool, people would say, "That's righteous." Well, after a show one night, one of the Marines yelled out to them, "Hey, that was righteous, brothers." And that really stuck with Bill and Bobby, because it was at that moment they felt like what they were doing was right. It was working, people liked it. They finally signed a deal with a recording label, but they realized they still didn't have a name. They really didn't think Billy and Bobby sounded right, and that's when they remembered that night at the venue. They decided to call themselves the Righteous Brothers. They went on to become a very famous duo. In 1965, they had their first #1 hit, You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling. And I'm sure you've heard it, or at least one of their songs. They're still played in commercials and movies. Bill Medley also worked on another iconic Patrick Swayze film. The Dirty Dancing theme song, I've Had the Time of My Life, was performed by Bill Medley and Jennifer Warnes, and they earned a Grammy Award. The Righteous Brothers would perform at various R&B clubs all over California and beyond, and women definitely went crazy over them. There was no lack of women throwing themselves at these men. Bill was definitely a ladies' man, and one night, while he was performing, he noticed this gorgeous woman in the crowd. He said out of all the people standing in the audience, he could just see her smiling face, and that's when he was like, wait a minute, I recognize her. Wow, that's Karen. It was his best friend from back in high school. She was graduated now and all grown up. So after he was done singing, he ran over to Karen and said hello. By the end of the night, he had gotten her phone number and asked her out on a date. She was 20, and Bill was 23. Well, they fell in love. It was like they were meant to be together, best friends that turned into lovers. Just a few months later, in 1964, the couple got married. Karen O'Grady became Karen Medley, and just under 2 years later, in 1965, they welcomed their son, Darren Medley, into the world. They were such a beautiful little family. I love this picture of them. To me, they look like royalty. They're just gorgeous, well-dressed, everything is perfect. It's like not one hair is out of place. Karen was thrown into this new world. She was basically famous overnight. The Righteous Brothers had gained an incredible amount of popularity, and this is not an easy life, especially not for a new mom who's staying at home with a baby while her husband performs at nightclubs and different venues all the time. Bill wasn't faithful to Karen, and that really ruined their magic. Bill admitted that he was having an affair with the singer Darlene Love. What made it worse was that he told Karen he fell in love with Darlene and couldn't help it. That caused a lot of pain for Karen. It hurt her deeply. She tried to stick it out, but by the time Darren was 5, Karen asked for a divorce. She still loved Bill. They still considered each other best friends, but Karen had enough. By the end of the relationship, both of them were already seeing other people. And it's sad, cheating can just shatter everything you tried so hard to build. Bill still loved Karen and wanted to be with her, but she decided to leave. That same year, Bill got married. Yep, to a woman named Susie Robertson, not the one he was cheating with. And while he was still married, y'all, Bill's dating another woman, Janice Gorham, and guess what? He tries to marry her too. I don't know what he was thinking. Bill, what are you doing? Well, I know what he's not doing. Being a husband, because both of the women found out, and both of the marriages were annulled. He once again tries to get back with Karen, but by now she's already engaged to Gerald Class and she's pregnant with her second child, who she would give birth to in 1971. His name is Damon Class. Unfortunately, the marriage to Jerry didn't work out. Karen became a single mom of 2 young boys living in Hermosa Beach, California, and going through her second divorce. Bill had moved about 40 minutes away to Newport Beach, California, and he was co-parenting Darren with Karen. The pair remained very close despite the painful divorce they had gone through earlier. They would talk on a regular basis, and Bill was very involved in his son's life as much as he could be, between juggling his music career, which was still going strong. In 1969, Bill performed Hey Jude at the Grammy Awards, and one of his recordings, Freedom and Fear, was nominated for a Grammy in 1972. Both Karen and Bill were very hopeful about their futures. Karen had really settled into her new routine in her quaint little house at 535 24th Place in Hermosa Beach. Here's the home right here, on this quiet little street, with houses that are very close together. This meant you got to know your neighbors pretty well, especially back when people actually used to talk to one another and welcome you into the neighborhood. Karen had a very busy social life. Everyone was charmed by her infectious smile and her laid-back personality. She was gorgeous, kind, good-hearted, and she was a great mother. She quickly made friends with 2 of her neighbors. One was Noel Castle, who lived right here to the right of Karen. Their homes were so close that their fences were actually connected, and they could just look over into each other's windows. The 2 of them became very close friends. They had a routine together with one other neighbor named Sue Kraft. The 3 of them would have coffee almost every morning after they dropped their kids off at school. By 1976, Darren was 10 and Damien was 4. Darren was in elementary school, and Damien attended the infamous McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach. The McMartin Preschool became one of the most notorious schools in the world in the 80s, and this notoriety was due to allegations of satanic rituals allegedly occurring at the school. There's way too much to dive into about that, and I'm sure there are plenty of videos here on YouTube you can watch. The only connection right now is that Karen's son attended before the allegations were made. There are so many other details and connections to other cases, like the Phil Spector connection. He was sent to prison for killing actress Lana Clarkson, and was also a very famous music producer who produced songs for the Righteous Brothers. But back to Karen, I just saw those connections and thought they were interesting. Back to Karen. She was living and thriving in Hermosa Beach. Karen spent a lot of her time here. She had a boyfriend in 1976, and I'm sure they came down here to the boardwalk. You also have the Hermosa Beach Pier, and of course, the absolutely gorgeous beach. Even though this town is small, there's a lot to do in Hermosa Beach. It is a prime location to live, and it's actually very family-oriented as well, from everything I know about Hermosa Beach. This is 24th Place, the little street where a brutal, heartbreaking crime is about to occur. One that stumped investigators and forensic teams for years and years. This is in front of Karen's house. It's still there. It's exactly the same house. And this right here next to it is Noel's house. You can see just how close these two homes are. You can also tell how small this street is. Now that you have a feel for the area Karen lived in, you can imagine her and her children walking the streets, her and her friends getting coffee and hanging out with the kids in the yard or driveway. It was January 1976. She and Darren were out in the driveway, playing around on his skateboard, when something happened. Karen flies off the skateboard and falls really hard on one of her legs. She ends up getting taken to the emergency room, and it turns out she actually broke her leg. Ow, that would be very painful. It's hard enough managing two young boys who are only 10 and 4, but now she's on crutches. She has to do her very best to still get around. And she does. She continues to take her boys to school every day and meet the ladies for breakfast every morning as usual. Until January 30th, when she doesn't show up. Early that Friday morning, Karen took Damien to McMartin Preschool before 9 a.m. It's only a 5-minute drive to the school. It was Bill's weekend with Darren, so Darren was already with him that day. Karen was supposed to meet Sue and Noel for breakfast soon after dropping Damien off, but she was a no-show, which was very unusual for her. Her friends were worried, not just because she didn't show up. This was not typical of Karen, but also because she was on crutches, having trouble getting around. So of course, if you're her friend, you're going to be more concerned. Maybe something happened, like she fell before getting to where they were going for breakfast. One of the women had seen Karen pulling back into her driveway after dropping Damien off, and that was around 9 a.m., so it did seem a little odd that she didn't meet up with them, but maybe she was just running late. They called her, but there was no answer. Since they were her next-door neighbors, they decided to walk over and see what was going on with Karen. They went straight to the back of her house because that's where a sliding glass door was located, and that's where Karen had been coming in and out of her house. It was easier for her to use that sliding door once she pulled into the driveway instead of trying to navigate the landscape towards the front of the house on crutches. As the two women got closer to the sliding glass door, they noticed it was open. Now, it wasn't uncommon for Karen to leave it unlocked, but it being completely open was a different story. When they looked beyond the glass door, they saw Karen's crutches on the ground inside. At first, their thought was, okay, that means she's home. They also saw some cookies on the countertop, but no Karen. They called her name several times, and she didn't answer. However, they thought they heard something, so they got quiet and listened. It sounded like Karen was moaning. At this point, they weren't really sure what to think. They decided to go around to the front door and knock like respectable neighbors, not just barge in. After all, she had a boyfriend. They didn't know what they were hearing, and they didn't know what to expect. But then something very unusual happened. When they got to the front door and were about to knock, they were shocked to see a man coming out of the door towards them. It was a man they had never seen before. They looked at each other, both thinking, what is going on? The man came out and said, "Hey ladies," and just kept walking right past them. He didn't say anything else. They were just standing there. Who was that? Because it wasn't Karen's boyfriend. So they're thinking, wait a minute, what is going on here? I mean, okay, maybe they didn't know all of Karen's business, but this seemed kind of odd. They could also still kind of faintly hear some kind of moaning or some noise coming from inside the house, and they were pretty freaked out at this point. So they decided to go to a neighbor's house. He was a firefighter, and they knew he also had a gun. They were that scared, so they wanted to make sure somebody could accompany them, someone who could protect them. The firefighter decides that they need to call 911. The dispatcher sends out firefighters, paramedics, and police to Karen's house. In these small towns, they send everyone out there. That is not unusual. You call 911, you're getting everybody. It's like they really don't have that much to do in a small town like this. The very first thing that police noticed when they got on the scene was that it kind of looked as though there had been a robbery, like the house had been burglarized because it was in complete disarray. Things were overturned, there were drawers taken out and rummaged through, and there were so many things out of place. But as they made their way towards Karen's bedroom, that is when they saw her. She was lying on the floor completely naked, and they could see that there was something tied around her neck. She was also tied up. As the paramedics rushed in to assist Karen, they realized that she had been severely beaten, but she was still breathing, albeit barely breathing, barely alive at this point. When they got closer, they could tell that it was a pair of pantyhose around her neck. One of the pantyhose legs was tied tightly around her throat, and there was also a bra strap around it as well. It looked like the other leg of the pantyhose was used to bind her hands and legs together so she couldn't move. Unbelievably, Karen was conscious at this time, and she was barely hanging on. They immediately rushed her to the hospital. Meanwhile, they started to put up the crime scene tape, and crime scene technicians were now on the scene. One of them was Bonnie Clark Johnson, a crime scene investigator. She was one of the first there to assess the scene, and it was obvious to her, with her expertise and experience, that this had been an event involving forced intercourse. It definitely looked like a struggle had taken place, and Bonnie noticed there was a towel that had fresh bodily fluids on it, so she took inventory of that. She also found a bra near where Karen was lying, and it had been cut off of her. It wasn't just unlatched, it was actually cut off. They also collected the nylon pantyhose and all of Karen's clothing. At the hospital, they took samples of bodily fluid, including some that was on and around Karen's body. No one could believe that this was going on in Hermosa Beach. This had been, and still is, considered a very safe area. The kind of crimes that happen in this area are simple break-ins, or maybe somebody stole someone's beach cruiser, something like that, but not something like this, and not to a person like Karen. It seemed so senseless and unbelievable. Now, the most important thing was for them to interview Sue and Noel, because they were the ones who saw that man coming out of Karen's house. They also knew Karen very well. They knew everybody she was usually associated with. The first thing they said was that they did not know who this man was. They did not recognize him. But they did want to give a description to the police so that they could start to canvass the neighborhood, asking neighbors, "Have you seen someone who matches this person's description? Is it a person who lived in this area?" They wanted to act fast because this man could still be walking around. The women described the man as about 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 9 inches, with dark hair and a beard but no mustache. His hair was kind of scraggly, like it was hanging a little bit in his face. They thought he was probably 160 pounds or so. He wasn't a big guy. He also didn't look scary or creepy. He was most likely in his 20s, and according to the women, he just looked like an ordinary guy. The only thing that made them afraid was the fact that they did not know who he was or what he was doing in Karen's house. After they got the description, the police officers were on foot, going door to door. Here's the neighborhood. These homes, as you have seen, are very close together. Police were counting on somebody who saw something, because back then, police relied on that grunt work, putting their shoes to the pavement, walking around, gathering clues and information so they could piece things together. There were no Ring camera doorbells or cell phones. They had to go to every door throughout the entire neighborhood and beyond, just crossing their fingers and hoping they would get a lead. And they did. A couple of the neighbors reported seeing a man in the area the last few days who matched the description. They said they saw him around Karen's house at one point, and other neighbors said, "Yep, we saw him too, and he did not belong here." He was walking around, and they didn't recognize him as part of their little community. This man was still out there, and women in this town were starting to become very frightened. They did not feel safe. They wanted this guy identified immediately, brought in, and arrested. There was a group of young moms that would get together regularly, and all of them were questioning if one of them was going to be next. So, what about Karen? Can't she just tell the police what happened and who did this to her? Well, no, unfortunately she can't because she's in a coma. Karen had been asphyxiated with those pantyhose. They had been tightly wound around her neck to the point that it was cutting off her oxygen. Unfortunately, she fell unconscious and she had not woken up yet, and she never would. That's right, Karen was unable to ever become fully conscious again. It was heartbreaking. Karen's friends and family had to be informed that unfortunately there was nothing the doctors could do. Karen had already suffered brain damage as a result of the lack of oxygen to her brain, and ultimately the decision was made to take Karen off life support. Karen was unable to breathe on her own, and she passed away on February 4th, 1976 at only 32 years old, leaving her 2 young sons behind. It's absolutely heartbreaking to think of those 2 little boys who no longer have a mother. Now, this was a homicide investigation. The investigators got the autopsy report back, and it was obvious that Karen fought for her life. There were defensive wounds on her body, and there were also ligature marks around her neck. At this point, the medical examiner was able to determine that she had suffered from a lack of oxygen for an extended period of time, most likely when the pantyhose and bra strap were around her neck, as she was lying there without assistance. It was said that if someone had come even 10 minutes earlier, she may not have died. Maybe this man would have been interrupted before he started strangling her, but that didn't happen. After analyzing the entire crime scene, they were able to determine that someone had definitely gone through a lot of the possessions in the home, and they had taken things. From what they could tell, it seemed as though this person was hiding inside Karen's house, waiting. When she came inside, they saw she was injured. She couldn't resist, and she couldn't run very fast, so they took advantage of her. Based on their analysis, they believed that Karen had actually been stalked, and that this person was lying in wait, ready to attack. Once this became a homicide investigation, the media went crazy, not just locally. This woman wasn't an ordinary person in a little seaside town. This was the ex-wife of a Hollywood superstar. So now all kinds of media outlets picked up the case. Hollywood had their opinions, thoughts, and speculations, and there was a lot of buzz going on. Stories began circulating about what people thought happened and who did it, and there were many who wanted Mr. Bill Medley, Karen's first ex-husband, to be questioned. As they interviewed friends and family, they discovered that Bill had been trying to get back with Karen multiple times, and she had refused. So now they were wondering, was this some type of revenge? Did Bill want Karen, and Karen didn't want him? Maybe he came there to get Darren for the weekend, and something happened. The police always look at the people closest to the victim first, and Bill and Karen were still supposed to be best friends, still talking, still seeing each other all the time, and co-parenting. Bill was close to Karen, close enough that she would have let him inside. So, maybe this wasn't a burglary, maybe it was revenge. They brought Bill in for questioning, and he was absolutely beside himself. He was shocked and devastated. He was in Lake Arrowhead, California, with his 10-year-old son Darren when he got the phone call, a call he would remember for the rest of his life. They told him that Karen was in the hospital in a coma that she was never going to wake up from. They told him there was nothing they could do. He went down to the hospital, pleading with the doctors to do something. He was like, please, please, please do whatever you can, but there was just nothing they could do. Bill was by Karen's bedside, saying, "Come on, honey, the boys need you. We all need you." He was just telling her positive things like that. This was very difficult for him. He told the police that he was a wreck, that he was actually having an out-of-body experience, and that he could not believe he was planning the funeral of his son's mother, that he was sitting there looking for caskets for Karen. It just did not make sense to him. She was such a beautiful person, inside and out, and he felt like he was living in a horror movie. The other thing was that Bill did not match the description of the man people saw walking around Hermosa. Not to mention, everyone knew who Bill Medley was and what he looked like, including Sue and Noel. They knew it wasn't Bill coming out of Karen's house that day. Bill was completely cooperative with the police, and he had an alibi. He was out of town with his son. They were out there to buy a cabin, and that transaction did occur far away from the crime scene. Bill also gave the police information about other people in Karen's life, including the man she was currently divorcing, Jerry Class. Could he have had a reason to want to hurt her? The police wanted to bring him in for questioning. They go through all of the information that he provides, including his alibi, and eventually, he's ruled out as well. The main reason, again, is because he does not match the description. They had 2 eyewitnesses who saw a man coming out of that house. Let's not forget, and it wasn't Karen's ex-husband's. Investigators need to move on because they're running out of time. They already know they missed their opportunity to find this man while he was still roaming around after the crime occurred. Now, they have so much pressure on them. This is a tiny police department in Hermosa. I can only imagine the pressure from Hollywood and the community wanting someone to be held responsible for this, but no one is being arrested, and they're running out of clues. They don't have any leads. The next idea that the investigators get is to stake out the funeral. This was an extremely heartbreaking time for anyone close to Karen, Bill, and the children, but investigators wanted to go there to see if anyone suspicious came to the funeral, or if anyone was acting strangely. Sometimes people who commit these crimes sort of want a souvenir. They want to walk among everyone, come back to the scene, and sort of look at everything they've done. The funeral was held at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. As they went through the crowd undercover, looking around, they didn't see anything out of the ordinary. They were getting pretty desperate, so they decided to try something else. Something kind of controversial and not very scientific. They decided to put Noelle Castle under hypnosis. She's the friend who saw the guy coming out of the house. This was actually the very first time hypnosis was used to get information like this in a criminal case in California. This was not something the courts were used to seeing, but they had no choice. They were going to do everything they could. Their goal was to get more information about the man Noel saw coming out of Karen's house. So they put her under hypnosis to see if she could give them more details, like what his face, nose, and mouth looked like. Everything. While she's under hypnosis, they have a sketch artist working, and they create a sort of 3D composite. From what I understand, and I could be wrong, but I believe I read it was made of clay, this was the bust that was made from the description and the sketch during the hypnosis session with Noelle Castle. This is what she said the man looked like. He had shaggy hair, sort of like a bowl cut, but a little shaggier, hanging down just below his ears. He also had a beard, but no mustache. This was the biggest lead they had at this point in the case. They photographed the 3D model and printed flyers to distribute all around the city. Detectives were hoping that someone would see the 3D model and recognize who this was. But to their surprise, very little came of their efforts. So they reviewed the suspect list again and found another potential suspect. The sketch and the 3D model kind of looked like a firefighter one of the police officers knew of. Not a good guy, someone who had been involved in some sexual misconduct cases. They also needed to look into Karen's current boyfriend, so they brought the firefighter in. He told investigators he was back in Orange County at his accountant's office, getting his taxes done, and had nothing to do with the crime. They decided to map out the route from where the firefighter was to Karen's house to see if he could have had time to carry out the crime. It turns out the timeline just didn't fit, and there was other specific information provided that ruled him out. The same thing happened with Karen's boyfriend. It was unlikely, though possible but highly unlikely, that there were two men inside Karen's house that day. Meaning, if somebody didn't match the description of the man the women saw coming out, they were probably not involved. It was improbable that another guy was hiding in there, responsible for the crime. There were two other suspects in Karen's murder, a neighbor's son and his friend. This was because detectives considered the possibility that Karen's murder might have been motivated by revenge. These two young men had argued with her husband, Jerry, at the time. However, upon confirming their alibis, the two young men were also cleared. Karen's murder was eventually classified as a cold case. Unfortunately, years went by, you already know how many, and then it was 1984. I already hinted at the McMartin preschool investigation. Well, during that investigation, detectives briefly reopened Karen's case because they wanted to make sure there wasn't any kind of link between the alleged satanic ritual situation at the preschool and Karen's murder. I'm not going to go into detail, but a woman named Virginia McMartin founded and ran the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach. This is what is there now. It is just a dry cleaning business. But this is where it used to be located, and this is where it was in proximity to Karen's house. It was just 5 minutes away. Virginia, the owner of the preschool, had a daughter, Peggy McMartin Bucky, and Peggy also worked at the school as an administrator. Peggy's son, Ray Bucky, was a teacher there, and his sister, also named Peggy after their mom, worked there part-time as well. It was a family business. One of the students' mothers noticed a rash on her son's bottom during the summer of 1983, and she claimed that Ray Bucky did something indecent to her son. But that's not all. She went on to make further pretty outrageous allegations. In 1990, the New York Times wrote an article where this mother reported that the daycare employees had relations with animals and that they were Satanists. Following these initial allegations, the police interviewed hundreds of children and parents of children who had previously attended McMartin Preschool or were currently enrolled. During the spring of 1984, more than 350 students and former students claimed that they had been mistreated as part of a satanic ritual. In total, more than 321 charges were filed against 7 of the McMartin Preschool employees, and this trial ended up lasting 7 years, costing the state of California millions of dollars. But by 1990, all of the charges against the employees and the owners were dropped. Meanwhile, detectives found no link between the school and Karen's murder. But it did need to be looked into, considering her son did attend around the time frame that other children who came forward were also in attendance. That same year, detectives on Karen's case met with detectives from across the country to discuss something else. Someone else, an alleged serial killer named Henry Lee Lucas. He had been linked to several hundred murders, but Karen's case was not one of them. In the end, detectives found out that Henry Lee Lucas was a serial false confessor. He would confess to murder after murder after murder, using information that police were sort of feeding to him. He did this so he could get special treatment in prison. Although Henry Lee Lucas did confess to killing many people, it's actually believed that he did not commit nearly as many crimes as he claimed, and he definitely was not connected to Karen's murder. Back in 1976, when this crime occurred, DNA was collected in the form of semen on Karen's body and a towel, as I mentioned, but the technology was not advanced enough at the time to make any kind of determination about who that semen belonged to. However, by 1999, detectives tried using CODIS to identify their suspect. This database includes anyone who has been in prison or even arrested in county jail in certain states and counties, because some places require a DNA sample to be taken, and those samples are put into CODIS. So the semen DNA from the towel at Karen's was put into CODIS to see if there was a match, but it was unsuccessful. There were no matches. It was a waiting game because there was something I did not know with all the cases I do. I did not know that once a DNA sample is submitted, it is automatically run from time to time by CODIS over the years to see if any new criminal matches come into the database. However, in order for this to happen, you have to rely on the killer getting caught for some other crime to get into the database. Detectives investigating Karen's murder were losing hope that justice would ever be served. 10 years after submitting that DNA to CODIS, detectives decided to revisit the case again. It's hard to forget Karen's case for many reasons, but one of them for me now is if I ever hear any of the Righteous Brothers songs, I will instantly think of Karen. The investigators who worked on this case were of the age group that listened to and knew the Righteous Brothers so much. It came from their generation. So, this case most likely stayed on their minds throughout the years. They believed there were still witnesses and people who knew more about this murder who hadn't spoken up yet. Plus, DNA technology had advanced, and detectives began considering creating an even better DNA sample because now there was another way to match criminals to crimes through their relatives. It's called familial DNA. What this means is that maybe a cousin, an uncle, a sister, a brother, or your dad commits a crime, and their DNA is in CODIS, but the killer's isn't yet. Well, with this new technique, still looked at as controversial by the way for privacy reasons, which is at the top of the list, it was being considered as a way to find a connection in Karen's case. If they connect a relative's DNA, they can track down that relative and find out if they can provide insight or if they know whether their family member committed this crime. The cold case detectives considered familial DNA for Karen's murderer. At the time, familial DNA was only legal in 10 states. The method was called into question by human rights activists because they claimed that it produced false leads and violated people's privacy. How it works is that through a DNA database, such as one called GDmatch, familial DNA searches try to find relatives of these potential suspects. Despite their inability to match that exact person, they can get a partial match. When they identify this child, sibling, or other blood relative, they can go through that suspect's family tree, which can contain hundreds or thousands of relatives. So what they do is have a genealogist create this suspect's family tree and build it out. Then, they use circumstantial evidence collected over the years to narrow down their search to one person who had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crime. For example, after 30 years since his last crime spree, the Golden State Killer was finally identified as former police officer Joseph D'Angelo, and this was done through familial DNA. Another California serial killer, Lonnie Franklin, or as he was known at the time, the Grim Sleeper, was found using the exact same process. But this process had to be approved by the district attorney and individuals all the way up to the Department of Justice here in California. They do not grant permission easily. But luckily in 2011, detectives finally obtained permission and they submitted the DNA profile from the crime scene to the labs for familial DNA testing. They were so hopeful, but it turned out there was no match. This was very disappointing because, unlike CODIS, this system for familial DNA does not continue automatically scanning. They don't have that function, so they would have to get approved again at some other point and run the DNA again. But these detectives were not going to give up easily. They requested to run that DNA again in 2016, and they got the approval. It was a go. From 1976 to 2016, there was nothing, and finally, there was a match. Detectives who had diligently investigated Karen's murder for so many years finally received that phone call that they had been waiting for. The lab notified them that familial DNA had uncovered a potential suspect through a family member, and this was huge. All of the original detectives on this case were elated. They couldn't believe it. Many of them were retired and were being notified by their colleagues that they finally had an actual lead. 2 leads, in fact. There were 2 similar matches, one of which was a direct Y chromosome match. We're talking about like a dad or a brother. So next, the detectives have to do what they would usually do. I know this sounds odd, but once they find this match, they have to interview the said match and gather information. All they can do is ask questions. They track down his familial DNA match and start to ask whether or not this person has any connections to Hermosa Beach. That is the first question, and it turns out one of their relatives lived in Hermosa at the time the crime occurred. When they get the name of the relative, it turns out they lived in close proximity to Karen's house. They start to gather more and more information about who this person was, and through that person, they're able to pinpoint someone else, another relative, who would visit this person on a regular basis and was in the vicinity of the crime when it occurred. So now they are very certain they know who was responsible for Karen's murder. But it doesn't stop there. They need a DNA sample from said individual in order to match it directly to the semen found on the towel. This is a long process, but they finally have a name: Kenneth Eugene Troyer. He was 28 years old when he used to visit his relative in Hermosa Beach, and he was also in the vicinity of Karen's home at the time the crime occurred. Throughout his life, Ken had a history of robbery and sexual misconduct. Believe it or not, he spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. So you're probably saying to yourself, then why wasn't his DNA in CODIS? Why didn't they match his DNA sooner? The answer is because the CODIS system didn't start until about the 90s. They didn't start acquiring DNA for this database until then, so any crimes that happened before that database was created wouldn't have been in the system unless Kenneth had committed a crime after the system was created. Does that make sense? And his motive? Well, robbery. He would burglarize homes, and he wasn't in jail or prison on January 30th, 1976, which means he had the opportunity to commit this crime. This man was not a stable person. He had already committed various crimes just like the one that was committed on Karen. Except, obviously, hers turned into something more extreme, since she was actually killed in the commission of that forced intercourse. Without even getting a match, because they hadn't compared his exact DNA to the semen, they already know it is highly probable that this is their guy, considering everything else is circumstantial. And this is a controversial type of DNA match. They have to be even more diligent and make sure that they can prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is the person who committed this crime. So the sheriff's department was able to obtain a sample of Kenneth Eugene Troyer's DNA, and it was a 100% exact match to the semen that was on that towel at Karen's house. This was the man who burglarized Karen's home, severely injured her in the course of a struggle to force himself upon her, and ultimately strangled her to death. But when they were going to do something about it, like arrest him, that's when they got some very unexpected and disappointing news. Kenneth is dead. That was the other reason he stopped committing crimes, because he was dead. He died back in 1982. I should say killed. He was killed by a police officer because, get this, and this might be the only consolation considering he can't be tried and convicted for Karen's murder, but he actually escaped from a California prison. He was a serial burglar, and the cops were on his trail for doing this to several women. They were trying to hunt him down because this was a dangerous man, and he was repeating this behavior again and again. They were actually chasing him down in Orange County back in 1982, and he was killed by a Santa Ana police officer. Investigators were finally able to give Karen's family the closure that they had been waiting for all of these years. And one of those people that could finally breathe again was Bill Medley. His entire life changed after Karen was murdered. He said that her death changed his life dramatically. At that time in his life, before her death, his son was 10 years old, and he was living as a single dad in Newport Beach. But all of a sudden, he wasn't just a single dad anymore. He was a single parent, and it rocked both Darren and Damien's worlds too. It also changed Bill Medley's life forever because he stopped singing. He had to put his life back together. According to him, he took 6 years off. It took him that long just to get back on his feet. Bill actually did end up getting remarried in 1986 to his late wife Paula, and they had a daughter, McKenna. McKenna is also a singer, and she performs with Bill. She performed as a singing partner during his 2008 tour, entitled Time of My Life. Bill enjoyed a long and successful solo career after he came back to the music scene, even though he and Bob Hatfield split up from the Righteous Brothers in 1980. They still appeared together from time to time until, unfortunately, Bob died in 2003. Billy Joel actually inducted the Righteous Brothers into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that same year. In 2020, Bill had to have surgery to remove a cancerous growth from his throat. And that surgery kept him from touring for basically the first time in over 50 years, except for that time he wasn't singing because of Karen's murder. Unfortunately, after 5 years of fighting Parkinson's disease, his wife Paula died in June of 2020. Bill says that he wrote a song dedicated to Karen, and it's entitled Beautiful Lady. He performed it in Las Vegas at Harrah's. Bill said that the stage is a good distraction because it's always been a lifesaver for him. Here's Bill at a press conference that took place 41 years to the day after Karen's murder. This case really wouldn't have been solved without familial DNA, and it's only used in the most extreme cases. Many people think that they shouldn't be investigated for crimes that their family members committed, that it's an invasion of privacy and circumstantial, that those are the two biggest arguments, because when they find that match, they have to go question that person, and that person, that family member, can decide not to say anything. Speaking of which, there were some people in that neighborhood that decided not to say anything back in 1976, because, believe it or not, there were people who knew Kenneth and that he was most likely the person who committed this crime. He matched that description, he matched that sketch, and he matched the 3D bust. But they kept quiet, and when the truth finally came out, there were a lot of people who called it a cover-up because they never came forward. Valentine's Day. It's supposed to be a time for love and celebration, spending time with that special someone. But that's not what happened for Nicole Waller on Valentine's Day back in 2013. This is her story. Today's video is a holiday homicide, which means it has a holiday component to it. And because Valentine's Day is coming up, I thought it would be fitting to talk about a story that happened on Valentine's Day. Now let's get into the case for today. The first thing I want to do is introduce you to Nicole Yvonne Waller. She was born May 22, 1981, in the Flathead Valley region of northwestern Montana, and she was referred to as Nikki by those who knew and loved her. Nicole was said to be a social butterfly. She was referred to as a very loud, free spirit, and she had a sister named Carmen who said Nicole was very to the point and blunt, but she was also a wild child. She loved to have fun, and she was borderline mischievous. Nicole loved to make people laugh. She was the type of person who would give you the shirt off of her own back. As a child, Nicole and her family moved to Alaska, where she spent most of her childhood, but they returned to Kalispell, Montana in the late 1990s. Not long after returning there, Nicole's parents ultimately got divorced, but by the time Nicole was 18 years old, she was starting a family of her own. She got pregnant with her then boyfriend, and she decided it was time to calm her life down and create a good life for herself and her baby. She gave birth to a little girl that she named Ashlyn. However, Nicole decided to leave Ashlyn's father not long after she was born because she really wanted to create a good life for the two of them, as that was a really unhealthy relationship. And I respect that. So many times people stay together and say it's for their child, but in a lot of these situations, it's probably better for the child that they don't stay together. The next relationship that Nicole had was with a man named Jason Waller, and she went on to marry him in 2002 at the age of 21 years old. They had 2 sons together, Austin and Richie. Nicole and Jason had a good relationship for a long time, but then things soured, and the two decided that it was best for them to separate. They did remain close despite the separation, and after the separation from Jason, Nicole ended up reconnecting with a friend from high school. His name was Cody Johnston. Nicole's family took Cody into their home and let him stay with them for a few months back in 1997, when Cody was just a senior in high school. The two reconnected through good old Facebook and eventually began dating. Now, Nicole's friends and family liked Cody. They were very fond of him. They knew him to be a kind and caring man, and they thought that maybe this was going to be the one, the complete package that Nicole needed. Cody was a diesel mechanic out in the oil fields, and he was making upward of 6 figures a year, so that was pretty good, a nice quality for Nicole to see in a man who could take care of her and her children. Somebody stable, somebody that had a good job and a good income. At the time that Cody and Nicole reconnected, she was living in a single-wide trailer in Kalispell, and Cody was living in a home in Fairview, Montana. They had a long-distance relationship where Nicole would travel to Fairview, and Cody would travel to Kalispell for them to see one another. Nicole would do this anytime her kids were with their father. Around 5 months into their relationship, Cody generously purchased a trailer for Nicole and her children to live in. Nicole sold her single-wide trailer for $10,000 and applied these proceeds towards the purchase of the double-wide trailer from Cody. There was a balance of $2,000 left, which Nicole had agreed to pay in monthly payments to Cody. However, throughout the relationship, Nicole had not been making these payments, but Cody didn't pursue any kind of action to enforce their original agreement. Sometimes that happens in relationships. You're with someone, so exceptions are made. They were dating, so they probably just figured that along the way, Nicole would pay back the money. Nicole would tell her sister Carmen that she was so happy. It was the happiest that she had ever been when she was with Cody. It was important that Nicole did have someone who was caring and considerate of her, because Nicole had a health issue, and that issue had a big impact on her life. She needed someone who would be understanding, especially if complications came along and those health issues got worse. Unfortunately, in 2008 that happened. Nicole discovered that she had a tumor in her brain. She had surgery and had to have a shunt put in, which would help drain the internal blockages in her brain. This was a pretty big ordeal, and the operation resulted in Nicole no longer being able to work. She had been working as a certified nursing assistant, but she had to quit after her surgery due to the pain that she was experiencing. Nicole was on medication to relieve this pain, but often it just was not good enough. Nicole had a good friend, Mark Hines, who stepped up to become her caretaker after her surgery. He helped her get back on her feet and take care of the household and things that Nicole could no longer do by herself. So, when she and Cody met on Facebook, they had a long-distance relationship. They were about 9 hours away from each other, but they would make the trip to see one another pretty often. Nicole's ultimate goal was to be closer to Cody and, one day, move near him. But they were kind of still testing the waters, seeing how their relationship progressed. Over the months that Cody and Nicole were together, she began moving her belongings to Cody's home in Fairview because ultimately her goal was to move there with her children. Once her divorce was finalized, Nicole and Jason, her ex, were coming up on a time where they were going to be signing divorce papers. Nicole had planned, after signing the papers, to take her children and move the 500 miles away, across the state, to Montana's northern Dakota border, where Cody lived in the town of Fairview. She did have slight reservations as the date was approaching, and Nicole confided in her mom that she was nervous to move because she thought that area had become a lot more dangerous with an influx of workers and people who had moved there due to the Bakken oil boom. But she really wanted to be closer to Cody. This fear was somewhat warranted. Crime in one county in that area had actually risen at the time by 855% since the prior decade. There was something else worrying her. Cody and Nicole were going through a little bit of a rough patch. With everything that had happened with the surgery and Nicole's life changing, their relationship was just a little shaky at the time. They had been bickering a little more lately than they had before, and Nicole told her sister Carmen that she started feeling like Cody was being secretive with her. She just felt like something was off, and she couldn't put her finger on it. However, she didn't let that stop her. Everybody goes through these rough patches here and there, and Nicole was determined to make it work. Now, in 2012, for just a short period, Nicole and Cody did break up, and during that time, he started seeing someone else, a woman named Amber Fleming. This short break between Cody and Nicole didn't last very long, and they ended up getting back together. Nicole decided in February of 2013 to make the close to 9-hour drive from her home in Kalispell to Cody's home in Fairview. She told everyone close to her before she left that this trip was to see if she and Cody were still connected and if they could still work things out. If not, they were going to call it quits. It's an interesting time to do it since Valentine's Day was coming up, and it was the evening before Valentine's Day, Wednesday, February 13th, 2013, when Nicole texted her sister Carmen. She said, quote, "Couldn't work it out. I'm coming home tomorrow," end quote. The next morning, February 14th, 2013, Valentine's Day, Nicole sent the last text message that would ever come from her at 7:25 a.m., and that message went to Mark Hines, her caretaker, who was waiting for her back in Kalispell. It said, "I'm on my way." However, it wasn't until days later, on Monday, February 18th, that anyone would realize something wasn't right. That day, on the other end of Montana, Nicole's friend and caretaker were reporting her missing. Nicole had a doctor's appointment for Friday, February 15th, and she didn't show up, which wasn't like her to do. She never missed her doctor's appointments. Her caretaker, Mark, and her friend Faith Ask had tried contacting Nicole. They called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Faith did leave a message, but she didn't hear back from her, so they drove by Nicole's house to see if she was there. That's when she noticed that Nicole's vehicle was not in the driveway. Faith decided to call the police on February 18th and file a missing persons report. At this point, no one had even contacted Carmen or anyone else in Nicole's family before filing this police report about her being missing. Carmen found out the very same day, February 18th, that Nicole was missing, when that same caretaker called her to let her know that Nicole had missed the doctor's appointment. Carmen was used to Nicole taking a couple of days to recoup after getting back from a trip to Cody's, and then she'd usually hear from her. So, prior to that phone call from the caretaker, she wasn't really concerned. She figured she would hear from her when she was ready to talk. She knew Nicole was going through a lot. Once Carmen did hear the news, she tried calling and texting her, and when she never heard back from her, she decided to contact the county sheriff's office and report Nicole missing. Carmen had to break the news to her mother, and it was one of the hardest things she ever had to do. Her mom was like, "What is going on?" And Carmen had to explain that she had just gotten a phone call saying Nicole was missing. Nicole's mom started frantically yelling at Carmen, not out of anger, but because she was so worried and fearful. She knew that Nicole had a medical condition. She had 3 kids. What did Carmen mean? She's missing. An FBI agent and an officer ended up coming to Carmen's house and telling her that a highway patrol trooper had actually flagged Nicole's vehicle in Poplar, Montana. There was a lot going on that day. Nicole's 1999 Burgundy Ford Expedition had been found parked on the side of Highway 2 by a highway patrol officer. The exact same area where her vehicle was found was a desolate area on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. Nicole's vehicle ended up 70 miles away from Cody's home. These roads throughout Montana are desolate. If you break down or something happens, it could be hours until somebody comes to find you. The specific area where Nicole's vehicle was found actually had a nickname, Stab City, because of the extraordinary amount of stabbings that occur in this area. That is not a good sign. The trooper approached the vehicle, and he noticed that it was full of personal belongings. All the doors were locked. The trooper listened and heard a really odd sound coming from inside. He didn't recognize it, but he was concerned. He thought that someone could be stuck inside the vehicle, and it was 5 degrees outside, so he felt it was necessary to get into the vehicle as fast as possible. When he did manage to get inside, that's when he discovered where the noise was coming from. 2 live guinea pigs. I felt so sad when I heard this. I love those little things. They're so adorable. 2 of them were in the vehicle, thankfully still alive. The thing is, during this preliminary search, the officer found Nicole's keys in the center console. He attempted to start the vehicle and realized there was nothing wrong with it, so it wasn't as though Nicole had broken down. In his perspective, it was as though she had stopped here for some reason, then locked the keys inside the vehicle and walked off. But why? And as you can see, everything looks fairly normal. All of her belongings are inside, but there was a cover on the steering wheel that was hanging off. You can see it behind the steering wheel right here. Now, when the vehicle was transferred to the impound lot to be searched, it looked as if Nicole had packed up her life. All kinds of belongings were in the vehicle. In the back seat, I noticed a photo album. It looks like the front cover has her and Cody on it. There were also some pill bottles found in the vehicle, and this is medication that needs to be taken every 6 hours. As well as this box, I noticed it was a lockbox, and it had a lot of prescription medications inside. That was kind of peculiar to me, but we know that Nicole had health problems and needed medication. But why were they left inside the vehicle? Her family said she wouldn't go anywhere without her medication. Not only that, but the family pets were in this vehicle, the 2 guinea pigs. Nicole loved animals. She would have never left them unattended like that. There is also this calendar. It's a February calendar, as you can see, and it's on the floor here. On the calendar, if you look closely, I know it's not the best photo, you can see there are things filled in for weeks to come. Look, on November 14th, there's a heart, and it says, Cody Forever. Obviously, from what we know, they broke up the night before Valentine's Day, so of course she might have written this before she left his house. But there were appointments on this calendar and other things written down that she was going to attend to. One of the first things that Carmen and her mom did was call hospitals close by. They thought maybe, because of Nicole's neurological condition, something happened to her on this long drive home. But Nicole wasn't at any of the hospitals. Carmen decided to call Nicole's ex-husband, Jason Waller, to see if he'd heard from Nicole, and he said no. The last time he spoke to her was at 7 o'clock in the morning on Valentine's Day. Jason said that Nicole called to let him know that she was on her way home from her boyfriend Cody's. Jason was watching the kids, so she had to let him know she would be back sometime later that night. Carmen decided to band together with her friend Angie, as well as Nicole's longtime friend Cammie from high school. They were posting on Facebook, trying to get the word out. When Cammie first heard Nicole was missing, knowing her for so long, she was under the impression that Nicole might have just wanted to go off the grid. Maybe she was stressed, maybe she was having a moment where she wasn't thinking clearly. At least that's what they were hoping. But after a while, they started to think something else had happened. They didn't think something like this could happen to one of their own friends or family members, but those thoughts started to creep in. Was Nicole okay? Did something bad happen? Carmen decided to go to social media and share the news that her beloved sister was missing. She wrote in a post, quote, "Hey friends and family, we have some pretty devastating news today. My sister is missing. I need help," end quote. Comments were coming in, they were rolling in, saying that police needed to check Nicole's boyfriend, because of course it seems to always be the boyfriend or the husband in these situations. There's a saying, and I think I've only said it once in another one of my videos a long time ago. It goes like this: it's either the lover, the brother, or the significant other. At least that's what they say. And this time is no different. They really thought the boyfriend had to have something to do with it. Nicole's friends and family, however, did not think Cody was involved. They said that Nicole was like a tornado sometimes, and Cody was one of those people who could calm her storm. They were adamant that Cody would not hurt Nicole. Plus, just a year prior to this, around the area where Nicole's vehicle was found, a teacher named Sherry Arnold had gone missing. She disappeared one morning when she was taking a run, and it ended up being 2 random men that had killed her. So the police weren't going to just focus in one direction, especially because Sherry Arnold's case was still fresh in their minds. Like I said, the family had known Cody since they were all in high school, so when investigators asked them what they thought about Cody and if he had anything to do with this, they said there's no way he had anything to do with her disappearance. Of course, Cody was one of the first people that Carmen called, and he said he hadn't heard from her since Thursday, which was Valentine's Day, the day she left his house. Carmen was like, "Listen, my sister is missing. She never made it home." Nevertheless, the police still had to bring Cody in for questioning because he was Nicole's boyfriend, and he was the last person that anyone knew had seen her. So he willingly came in. He was very cooperative with investigators and open to answering their questions. Cody told the investigators that on February 13th, Nicole and he did have an argument, and they did decide that they were going to break up. Remember, that was sort of the point of this entire trip, to see if they still wanted to be together. Of course, after this happened, he didn't feel like it was right to be close to each other in that moment, so he went to his job site and slept there for the night, so that she could stay where she was and feel comfortable, and he could just get some space. He was there with another one of his workers. Cody said that the next morning, Valentine's Day, Nicole texted him, letting him know his dog was hungry and needed some food. This was around 7 o'clock in the morning. He said that Nicole also called him a couple of times that morning, but to be fair, he really didn't want to talk to her at the time. Cody said at this point, he turned his phone off. He just wanted to get some sleep. He went back to sleep until 8 o'clock. Nicole was packing up all of her belongings to move back to her home in the double wide. He goes on to say that when he woke back up, he got on his computer and actually terminated the service on Nicole's cell phone. Maybe out of spite, I don't know. But she was on his phone plan, and now that they broke up, he just figured, I'm not paying for it anymore, so he turned off her service. He said he wanted to turn her phone off because she kept texting and calling, and he really didn't want to hear from her anymore. So his only option, in his mind, was to shut off her service. So now they're thinking maybe this is the reason Nicole didn't text anyone. She was always texting, especially on her way home, and maybe something did happen to her. Without her phone, that could be a big problem. She could be stranded somewhere and not able to call for help. Cody said that he was aware that Nicole had planned on leaving that morning, and he decided that it would be best for him to just stay at his job site until she left, so that he did not have to see her. It was just too hard on him, and he told the investigators he ended up staying at his job site until about lunchtime. That's when he drove back to his house, which he claimed was empty when he arrived back in Kalispell. Nicole's friend, Cammie, had noticed there wasn't any talk about Nicole or her disappearance on the news, and there were no search parties getting ready to go out and look for her. She remembered seeing Sherry Arnold's face plastered all over the news, with search parties out there looking for her right away, and she couldn't understand why Nicole wasn't getting the same attention. That would bother me too. So, she decided to take matters into her own hands and created a Facebook page called Find Nicole Waller in order to post updates about the search for Nicole and try to get the word out about her disappearance. She was hoping that she would receive help from the public if they had any information. Cammie was really upset. She told everyone that she was going to start her own search party in Montana, but law enforcement officers told her she wasn't allowed to do that, and she felt so helpless. Law enforcement explained it wasn't as though they were trying to treat Nicole's case any differently from Sherry Arnold's, but there were differences. For example, Sherry was snatched while jogging. Her shoe was found on the side of the road, and that was a clue. They knew there was some kind of foul play, and there were a lot of leads. But in Nicole's case, there just weren't. They didn't know where to search. On February 20th, 2013, Carmen was tossing and turning in bed, and that's when she heard a text come in on her phone. So she went to check it, and she saw it was actually a Facebook message from her sister, Nicole. Carmen was excited. She couldn't believe it. She's like, wait a minute, she's responding. What's going on? She's reading the message. This meant her sister was still alive. But this excitement would not last very long. The message from her sister said, quote, "Everybody had a lovely evening, not coming home. Don't laugh at me. Sorry I let everyone down," end quote. So Carmen quickly messages Nicole back. She asks her, "Where are you?" She let her know that she hadn't let anyone down and that there were lots of people who were worried about her and looking for her. Of course, when she gets this message from her sister, she gets out of bed in the middle of the night and calls her friend Angie. She's like, "Oh my gosh, I just got this message from Nikki." So they both get out of bed, and now Angie's messaging Nikki through Facebook, trying to figure out if they could get any information. But Nicole never replied to this message. All hope was gone at this point. Carmen kept the message a secret. She didn't want to let her family know that Nicole had reached out because she didn't know if this was really Nicole, and she didn't want to get their hopes up. It just wasn't usual for Nicole not to answer her back, And after a while, Carmen began to grow skeptical of this Facebook message from Nicole for various reasons. She felt that Nicole wouldn't have just messaged her one time and then not replied to pretty serious questions like, "Where are you? People are worried." That was very uncharacteristic of Nicole. She was also a textaholic. She was always on her phone. Also, Nicole was a notoriously bad speller. She was known to abbreviate words whenever possible, and this message was spelled out completely, with no abbreviations, no incorrectly spelled words. The investigators on the case soon determined they did not believe that message actually came from Nicole. Can anyone else relate? I don't know. It was also kind of strange that Nicole had said, "I had a lovely night," because she's been gone a week. Why would she say she had a lovely night? There have been many nights that have passed. It just didn't make sense. However, they were also thinking maybe this all had to do with her neurological issues. Maybe she was having some kind of episode and wasn't thinking clearly. So now investigators are wondering, who would have been using Nicole's Facebook to message her sister? Well, of course, Cody's not the only man in Nicole's life. Nicole also had Jason, her ex, whom she was separated from, and they were nearing the day that they were supposed to sign the official divorce papers. With Nicole's relationship with Cody getting more serious and her considering moving across the state with her children, investigators had to consider the fact that Jason could have a motive. They quickly discovered that he and Nicole were still friends. They had a very good relationship with each other, especially a great co-parenting relationship. The two even had an open-door policy. Either one could stop by each other's houses whenever they wanted to in order to see their children. Also, everybody that investigators talked to about Jason let them know that he was a good dad and he wouldn't harm Nicole. He had no reason to. They were amicably getting a divorce. It didn't take long for investigators to rule out Jason for the time being. But speaking of more than one person in someone's life, investigators learned that Nicole hadn't been the only woman in Cody's life. Cody had started dating a new woman. Her name was Amber Fleming, and he started this relationship after Nicole disappeared. However, that's what people thought. It turns out this relationship had been going on before Nicole went missing. Nicole and Amber actually knew one another through their friend Cammie. Amber was a teacher. She was actually in Cammie's wedding in 1999. They all went to high school together. Nicole was actually a bridesmaid in that wedding, and Amber was the maid of honor. This is Nicole and Amber standing next to each other at the wedding. They were more acquaintances than they were friends, but they did have a mutual friend in Cammie. They came from two different friend groups. However, they were still friendly and they got along. Cammie considered herself best friends with both Nicole and Amber. They did interview Amber. She let the investigators know that she was under the impression that Cody and Nicole's relationship was over, and that Nicole had left Cody's house to return to her home. She said, to her knowledge, Cody and Nicole's relationship ended on Valentine's Day, and she spent the whole weekend with Cody after Nicole had left. She didn't find anything suspicious about his behavior at all. She said he would never do anything that would jeopardize his relationship with her, meaning if they were thinking he harmed Nicole, he wouldn't for Amber's sake. Amber said he doesn't even like to fight or argue. Amber was adamant that he was at work the entire time, and she even had a list of people who saw him there. She signed a release to let them look at her phone, and eventually, information would come out that would turn this case on its head and help investigators to narrow their sights onto one suspect. Nicole's birthday had come and gone, May 22nd, and her missing persons flyers were still being hung up all around town with her name, her date of birth, her height, only 5 foot, brown hair, hazel eyes, and the last time she was seen. Later, Cody decided to go to the double-wide trailer and empty it of most of Nicole's belongings, without even consulting her family, even though he had previously told Carmen that she could go inside her sister's home to remove personal belongings. He did end up letting her go in there in June, but that was after he had already been inside and had threatened Carmen that if she wasn't going to clean the whole thing out, then she couldn't retrieve any of Nicole's things. Cody ultimately sold the double-wide trailer a few months after Nicole's disappearance, and he didn't share any of the proceeds with Nicole's family, even though she had put forth $10,000 toward the purchase. Cody was the one person that everyone knew was trying to help Nicole financially and otherwise. Nicole's daughter, Ashlyn, was not keen on any of Nicole's other boyfriends, but Cody was different. She actually started to consider him more like a father figure since her own dad was out of the picture. However, they did have their ups and downs, and they would break up and then get back together. But 5 months before she went missing, she and Cody were back together, what seemed like for good, but it was kind of under false pretenses. It turns out Carmen let the investigators know that Nicole lied. Nicole lied and told Cody that she was pregnant with his child when she wasn't. She actually went so far as to take someone else's ultrasound pictures and doctor them up to make them look like they were hers. It turns out that this was kind of the reason why she and Cody were having issues and why they ultimately broke up that Valentine's Day. Because just a month before, Cody had found out the truth. Nicole had lied. They had gotten back together under false pretenses. Everything started to break down, and she finally admitted she wasn't pregnant. So, Carmen had a best friend who lived in a little town in Montana called Culbertson. He was a principal at a school that was right beside the road that Nicole would have had to take on her way back home. So they're searching for any kind of camera footage that could help in the investigation. And Carmen asked this principal friend if she would be able to get the footage from Valentine's Day to see if they could find anything on that tape that would be helpful. As the principal goes through this footage, on the day that Nicole had last been heard from, he recognized a vehicle that matched the description that Carmen had given him of Nicole's vehicle, a two-tone maroon SUV. This vehicle was seen driving by the school. This was the only surveillance camera between Cody's home and the Poplar area where the vehicle was found, and it was on top of the high school. The time that Nicole's vehicle passed the school was a little odd because her last text message to her caregiver was at 7:25 in the morning, and her car passed the school at around 10:09 a.m. This school was only 30 miles away from Cody's, so this meant it took her 2 hours to go 30 miles. That just didn't make sense. That's why the investigators continued to watch the tape before Nicole's vehicle passed and after it had passed, and they didn't have to wait long to see what happened next. Here's the thing, very quickly after that SUV exited the security camera's frame, another vehicle approached. It looked like it was following the SUV. That's creepy. I can just imagine this playing out, imagine watching this and thinking, what's going on? This second vehicle was a Ford F-350 and it had an amber light on the top of it. When I say an amber light, this is an amber warning light on top of a vehicle. This is what it looks like. It's similar to what a cop would have on their car, except yellow. Neither one of these vehicles' license plates were visible on camera, but investigators felt as if the Ford F-350 was distinct enough with that amber light on top of it that they would be able to figure out who owned it fairly quickly. And they were right. They got the name Bill Soderberg from locals, and when they went to Bill's farm, they saw the F-350. Sure enough, it had an amber light on top. This was the investigators' biggest lead yet. Was Nicole in this person's farmhouse? Is this person a suspect, or is this person a witness? Bill and his wife came to the door. Investigators told Bill they needed to speak with him, along with an FBI agent, so they took him out of the house and began to explain what was going on. There were 2 investigators and an FBI agent, and they didn't even notice, since they were so fixated on getting Bill to explain why his car was following Nicole's. They didn't notice Bill had a .45 caliber gun in his hand while being questioned. Soon, one of the investigators realized it and said, "Bill, can you please put your gun down?" He took out the magazine and put it down. He made sure it wasn't loaded, but that's really not a good first impression. What ended up happening, according to Bill, is that he thought the FBI agent was a hitman because of the way he was dressed. So he got his gun thinking they were there to kill him. At least that's what he said. Why was he so scared? Why did he think a hitman was after him? Well, wait until you hear what he really thought and who he thought sent these men, his buddy Cody. But why in the world would Bill assume his friend would want to send people to kill him? That's what investigators want to find out. He was very cooperative from the beginning. He let investigators know that Cody did call him on Valentine's Day morning and asked him if he would be able to pick him up and give him a ride back from Poplar. Cody told Bill then that Nicole had driven off with another man, and because of this, he was wanting to abandon her vehicle as a prank. Does that make any sense to you? Who is this other man? Why didn't Cody tell investigators about this other man? I mean, he said that they argued and that they broke up, but wasn't it their intention to find out whether their relationship was going to work out? And why would a friend think this was a funny prank to abandon a vehicle somewhere? Around 9:30 that morning, Cody got into Nicole's Ford Expedition and drove it to meet Bill. Bill says he then followed Cody about a mile past Poplar, where Cody then stopped, got out of the Ford Expedition, locked the doors, and got into Bill's truck. Bill told the investigators that he also noticed that Cody had on white leather gloves when he got out of the vehicle. Bill told the investigators that he also noticed that Cody had on white leather gloves when he got out of the vehicle. As he got into Bill's truck, he noticed Cody had 2 cell phones too, and Bill didn't find this suspicious at all. I mean, I guess he did because he noticed. Bill told the investigators that as they made their way towards Sydney, Cody had been busy taking apart one of the cell phones that he had with him. He's taking apart a cell phone? Sir, I would find that really suspicious. Bill also let the officers know that multiple times that day, Cody had asked him if he had, wait for it, a barrel that Cody could have. Really? Bill responded that he had some at his house, but Cody told him he would need one that had a lid on top of it, which Bill didn't have. He was basically asking for a 55-gallon drum. According to Bill, that's more than enough room to fit a body inside, and he wanted one with a lid on it. Bill also let the investigators know that Cody had called him the very next day and said, "Hey, if anyone were to ever ask about that day, Valentine's Day, just forget that the 2 of us had ever taken that little ride to Poplar and back. Just erase it from your memory." I was watching Dateline, and they had this really interesting phrase that I'd never heard before. A good friend will help you move, but a best friend will help you move a body. I had never heard this before in all the years that I've been watching and researching true crime. So is it true? Would you do that for a friend? Did Bill do that? After their conversation with Bill, the police felt they needed to detain Cody and question him once again. I think so. After being detained and brought in at gunpoint to be questioned, Cody remained pretty quiet. He repeatedly asked the investigators, "Why are you questioning me again? Why am I here again?" Cody told investigators he never asked for a barrel for any sinister reasons. He was asking for a grease drum. It's only 3 feet high and 18 inches in diameter, and he wanted it to clean his tools. While Cody was detained, police executed a search warrant on Cody's house. I do have pictures of when they searched, and they went through every single room. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but they did end up finding some red stains on the ceiling near the kitchen, which they swabbed for testing. The results came back, and it was not blood. They determined it was most likely spaghetti sauce. Additionally, they noticed that one area of the garage seemed to have been recently cleaned. After being cooperative and undergoing 2 interviews with investigators, Cody started to get frustrated. In one of those interviews, after being there for several hours and them just continuing to question him about his timeline again and again, he pretty much said, "You know what? It's time for me to leave. If I'm not under arrest, I'm going." He explained that he had always been there for Nicole and her kids for a long time, and he just realized the importance of finding her. But at that point, he had already given them everything he could. They did let Amber and Cody leave, but they took his white truck in to be analyzed. While searching, they ended up finding something suspicious, something of Nicole's. While searching Cody's truck, police looked into the diamond plate toolbox on the back of the truck and found a black garbage bag. This garbage bag contained a small safe. They thought this safe might hold a clue to what happened to Nicole. From within the locked safe, they could see documents kind of sticking out, and Nicole's name was on some of these documents. So why would they be in Cody's possession? This gave them cause to open it. They had a strong suspicion that Cody was responsible for whatever happened to Nicole. Investigators think that Cody knew exactly what he was doing by leaving Nicole's car where he did. I told you this place had a nickname, Stab City. They think Cody did this to throw the investigation off. If this was truly a joke, it wasn't funny. They went to Nicole's family with this information, telling them that they believed Nicole had been murdered and that they believed Cody was the one responsible. Unfortunately, they had to inform the family that they did not have enough evidence at that moment to arrest him. When investigators told Nicole's family what they thought happened to their loved one, it was unbelievable for them to imagine. Cody, someone who cared for Nicole financially and otherwise, who looked after her children, could do such a thing. Just put her in a barrel and treat her like a piece of garbage. It was also hard for Cammie because, remember, she was friends with Nicole, and now she had to accept the fact that she was probably dead. But it was even harder to accept the fact that her other friend, Amber, the one who was the maid of honor at her wedding, could be dating a killer. But she wouldn't be dating him for long, because in March of 2014, a year after Nicole had gone missing, Amber got engaged to Cody, and soon after that, they got married. Nicole's family was grief-stricken with the thought that their beloved Nicole had been murdered, and the fact that the prime suspect was not in jail but seemed to be living it up, doing whatever he wanted in his life, being happy and acting as though nothing had changed. It made them sick. One of the investigators, Agent Mark Hillard, wasn't going to give up. He was searching the prairies, looking through oil fields, but this poor man, who dedicated so much time to Nicole's case, was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma cancer in 2014 and could no longer continue his work. He had to break the news to Nicole's family that he wouldn't be on the case anymore, but he promised them her case would be in good hands. Wait until you hear this shocking coincidence. He wasn't the only one fighting cancer. Brant Light, the prosecuting attorney, discovered that he had lung cancer. The two were fighting cancer side by side, undergoing chemotherapy together, not knowing if they would live long enough to figure out who killed Nicole. Believe it or not, these two men were sitting next to each other, receiving their treatments and discussing Nicole's case. They were working from the hospital. Now, that's dedication. 2 years went by without finding a body or arresting anyone. But that would all change in August 2015, when a new piece of evidence emerged that would bring justice to Nicole and her family. Analysts turned over cell phone information to investigators that showed the locations of Nicole's and Cody's phones in the days leading up to and following her disappearance. Nicole's phone was found in an area of Cody's Fairview home on the morning of Valentine's Day, where everyone expected her to be. However, Cody's story started to fall apart because the evidence indicated that he hadn't ignored Nicole at all. Instead, it showed him calling her multiple times as he appeared to be traveling from the work site back toward his home. Furthermore, Cody's phone showed up back at his house at 7:26 a.m., only 1 minute after Nicole's final text message was sent. By this time, Agent Hilliard was back on the job, still undergoing chemotherapy, but ready to work. He was the one who got to put the handcuffs on the person charged with Nicole's murder, Cody Johnston. This gave investigators the confidence that they now had enough evidence to arrest Cody. And on August 25, 2015, they charged him with the deliberate homicide of Nicole Waller. Now it was time to piece together the evidence and determine what exactly happened on Valentine's Day of 2013 and why it happened. Police learned that Cody and Nicole had a buy-sell agreement on the trailer he purchased for her and her children. She would pay him $2,000 in $100 monthly payments. However, it turned out that Cody was texting Amber just weeks before Nicole went missing, and Amber was insisting that Cody end his relationship with Nicole if he wanted to continue seeing her. She even mentioned wanting to get Nicole evicted from the double wide as part of the deal. Although investigators didn't think Amber had anything physically to do with Nicole's disappearance, They believed her comments about not being with Cody if Nicole was still in the picture contributed to his desire to get rid of Nicole. Right before Valentine's Day, Amber was putting a lot of pressure on Cody to make a choice. He told her he was going to get the trailer back. When I looked back through the photos of Cody's house during the search, I noticed a Valentine's Day gift on the table, and couldn't help but wonder, was that a gift to Amber or from her? Did she get her Valentine's Day wish to spend the night with Cody while Nicole was dead? On the night before Valentine's Day, Cody had a handyman friend put padlocks on Nicole's home while she was with him. Knowing that Nicole was leaving with her car packed, Cody had his high school buddy Frank go over and put padlocks on the doors and screw the windows closed, preventing Nicole from getting back in when she returned home. That's pretty messed up. Nicole's ex-husband, Jason, was the one who drove by and saw the padlocks on her house. He informed her, which was bound to cause an argument between Nicole and Cody. This led to Nicole calling Cody that Valentine's Day morning to inform him that he would not be getting the trailer and wouldn't be receiving the money. Investigators believe that this alone was the last straw for Cody. He left work angry and confronted Nicole before she left, possibly seeking to retrieve the buy-sell agreement, which is why that safe becomes significant. Inside that safe was the sales agreement. When Cody showed up days later at her house, he was trying to retrieve the safe with the sales agreement inside. Cody explained to investigators that he believed he still owned the double-wide trailer because he was the one who initially purchased it and because Nicole still owed him money. Therefore, he decided to have a friend put locks on it to secure it. It probably wasn't the nicest thing to do, but they were in a breakup. Cody had been lied to and was feeling a certain way about the whole situation. Although Cody chose to end the relationship, Nicole still tried to invite him over for dinner and a movie on February 13th, but he decided he needed space. Investigators discovered that it wasn't Nicole calling Cody that morning. Instead, he was calling her repeatedly as he got closer to his home, and she was growing angrier with each call. According to cell phone data, GPS coordinates, and cell towers, Cody arrived back in Fairview at his home just 1 minute after Nicole texted Mark that she was on her way home. They believed that when Cody arrived, he quickly attacked Nicole. Many theorized that since there was no blood, he strangled her to death at around 9:30 a.m. After that, he went to his friend Bill's house to ask for barrels to help ditch Nicole's vehicle. From 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., Cody's phone was off. Later, at 1 p.m., he visited a convenience store, where he was caught on camera. It was unusual for him to turn off his phone for several hours during a random day. This indicated he was trying to avoid being tracked. The real nail in the coffin for Cody came when he asked friends to pretend to be Nicole from her Facebook account and message her sister. A couple of friends refused, but eventually, he found one who agreed to do his dirty work. That person later came forward, feeling terrible about what they had done. Cody was offered a plea deal that would allow him to plead guilty and lead investigators to where Nicole's body was. In exchange, he would receive an 80-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 17 years. However, he declined the offer, meaning the case had to go to trial. Perhaps the defense attorneys were hoping that prosecutor Brant Light would succumb to his cancer. However, even if he had, someone else would have taken over the case. Despite being seriously ill, this prosecutor completed his chemotherapy 3 weeks before the trial against doctors' orders. He risked his own life to gain the energy needed to fight this case, knowing that if he underwent treatment, he wouldn't have the stamina to see it through. He did have 2 assistants to support him, just in case something happened. 3.5 years after Nicole's disappearance, Cody's trial began in October 2016. Despite the investigators' and prosecutors' certainty that Cody was responsible for Nicole's disappearance and presumed murder, no one in Montana had ever been charged with deliberate homicide, equivalent to first-degree murder in other states, without a body being found. During the trial, Amber, now Cody's wife, sat in the front row with their newborn baby. It was heartbreaking for everyone involved, knowing that while Nicole's life was tragically cut short, Cody's continued on, leaving her 3 children behind. Much to the prosecutor's surprise, Cody took the stand as the only witness for the defense. While he admitted to certain actions, these were mostly things that prosecution witnesses had already testified to. Cody acknowledged that he had asked a friend to log into Nicole's Facebook and message her sister days after her disappearance. He claimed it was harmless and intended to divert some attention away from him since he was the prime suspect at the time. Cody told the court how he loved Nicole and her children, stating that he took care of them, attended all of Nicole's hospital appointments, and financially assisted her by helping her purchase and renovate the trailer. He portrayed himself as a loving father and husband, even claiming he did the right thing when Nicole lied to him about being pregnant. He stated that he broke up with Amber to return to Nicole, but he struggled with the fact that Nicole could carry on such a significant lie for so long, fooling him completely. According to Cody, another issue contributing to their breakup was Nicole's addiction to painkillers. He claimed he had been begging her to get help and enter treatment. When I looked back at pictures of her vehicle, I noticed something concerning. According to him, she had been making trips to methadone clinics every couple of weeks due to her addiction. This was very sad, especially given the prescription bottles found in her vehicle, which clearly had her name, the dispensing date, and the drug methadone, similar to morphine. Prosecutors argued that Nicole had been clean for months, but Cody insisted otherwise. It wasn't true. The reason they broke up the day before Valentine's Day was because he found out she was using again. The bottles from her car have the date on it, and this shows that he might be telling the truth. The bottle says it was dispensed on February 1st. He says Nicole refused to go to treatment because she said she couldn't. She had kids to take care of. None of this changes the fact that something happened to Nicole. Cody also admitted that he had lied to investigators. Remember when he said he hadn't left work that day until lunch? Well, he admitted that he actually left at the time the phone records showed he did. Oh, that's convenient because, they don't lie. He had gotten worried about Nicole and her well-being since they broke up, and he knew she was doing drugs. He drove back over there towards his house. But when he got there, he said Nicole's vehicle was still there, but that she was nowhere to be found. So he claimed that he just assumed that she had gone to the store to purchase some cigarettes or that someone came to pick her up. Lastly, he also admitted to the fact that he had moved Nicole's vehicle, saying that he knows it was childish and vindictive, but he did it because he was mad, and he just wanted to get back at her, make it hard for her to get back to her car. Even though the prosecutors didn't think that Cody would take the stand, Brant Light prepared hundreds of questions for him just in case, and he got the chance to cross-examine him, and he went hard. One of those questions was, "This is all about you getting away with murder, correct?" To which, obviously, Cody said no. Oh, and I have to mention this. Cody ends up making a big mistake when he's on the stand. The prosecutor asked him, after dumping Nicole's vehicle and hiding her body, "You spent the weekend with Amber, correct?" And Cody says yes, but then he's like, wait a minute, no. And then he clarified, "I didn't dump her body, but yes, I did spend the weekend with Amber." Wow, a little too late. The prosecutor concluded in the state's closing argument the following statement. "Somewhere in Montana, Nicole Waller lies in a cold and lonely grave, taken from her children, taken from her family by that man, Cody Johnston." That's sad. The trial concluded in 4 days, and the jury only took 3 hours to deliberate and come back with a guilty verdict. Cody was found guilty of 1 count of deliberate homicide and found guilty on 1 count of tampering with physical evidence. This is the first case in Montana where they got a guilty verdict of murder without a body. After the verdict was read, Cody went and hugged Amber, and it was sad. They embraced and they were both crying. What I found heartwarming was that Nicole's sister, Carmen, turned to her friend Angie, and she said, "Is it weird that I just want to go over there and hug Amber?" After all, she was losing her husband and the father of her newborn at that time. But that just goes to show you the heart that Nicole's family had. What's really frightening is when I look at this text message, I see the one that says, "Your dog needs food" at 6:51, but look at the one before it. You can only see a portion of it, but it was never mentioned anywhere. It said, "Partially killed me," over and over and over. And for the life of me, I'll never know what the rest of the text message says, but I can only assume it said something like, "With everything you've done to me, it has killed me over and over and over." As though the pain she was going through, whatever they were going through during this breakup, I'm assuming, was killing her. Sentencing was in January of 2017, and a new face was in the courtroom, Nicole's daughter, Ashlyn. She was only 12 years old when her mom went missing. She was 12. That poor little girl. She took the stand to provide a victim impact statement. "I always tried to protect my mother from her boyfriends because I was afraid something like this would happen. She would ask me, 'Why can't you let me be happy?' I tried to let her be happy with Cody, but now I feel like I could have saved her. I feel like it's my fault." It is not. She could not have done anything differently that would have made a different outcome here. It's someone's choice. It's someone's evil choice to take someone's life, to harm them, and it breaks my heart that her daughter would even feel that way. But I understand how hard it is when you do in your heart feel like you could have done something different. At the time of Cody's sentencing, according to the Sydney Herald, out of the 400 nobody cases in the history of the United States, there had only been 80 that had resulted in life sentences, which is what the prosecution was looking for. Brant Light spoke during the sentencing hearing, and he let it be known that he felt like Cody deserved a life sentence, saying, "The defendant should not be rewarded for successfully hiding Nicole's body. The defendant has had a chance to bring comfort to the victim's family by telling us where the body is, but he refuses. Due to the horrendous nature and effect that this crime has had on the victim's family, this case screams for the defendant to be held accountable." Prosecutors asserted that despite the fact that Nicole's body had never been found, there was no sign that she was still alive. She had a Western Union bank account where she would receive her child support payments by direct deposit and had continued to receive these payments many, many months after she disappeared. But despite this money accumulating in her account, none of it was ever withdrawn. That's another thing. She never reached out to her children again, and her family knew she would never do that. It would have to take death. That was the only thing that would separate her from her own children. After hearing multiple testimonies during the sentencing phase of the trial, Cody ended up being sentenced to life in prison for the deliberate homicide of Nicole Waller, and he also received a 10-year sentence on top of that for tampering with physical evidence. Still today, Cody maintains his innocence in Nicole's disappearance and her suspected murder. This man ends up doing an inmate interview with Dateline, and Josh Mankiewicz interviewed him. This was only a little while after the trial, and Cody was still claiming that he was innocent. When Josh interviewed him, he said, "You know you're putting Nicole's family through agony. If you know where Nicole's body is, tell them." And he said, I know I'd be doing that if I knew where she was, but I don't." He also said he planned to appeal and wanted his son to know that he loves him, and he didn't do it. Cody claimed he was sorry that he lied. He was sorry that he moved Nicole's car. But then the interviewer from Dateline got to see another side of him when he started to press him a little more. He goes off. He gets super defensive. He blows up. He says, "I'm done." He even said, "F you" to Josh. He said, "F you, you beep." It was bad. He called him arrogant, and then he was like, "How was that?" Cody said, "I'm not gonna let you make me look like an a-hole. All I have to say is, I think you're doing a pretty good job of that yourself, buddy." After seeing that interview, I don't have a doubt, not one doubt in my mind for a second, that this guy did it. It's clear to me, it was clear before, but after I saw him blow up like that, I can tell he's an angry person. He's currently appealing his conviction with the Montana Supreme Court and seeking a new trial. He and his attorneys allege that the prosecution violated his rights, and they argue that he wasn't given a fair trial, which they believe should be grounds for a reversal of his conviction and a new trial. As of now, Cody will first be eligible for parole in 2049. Prosecutor Brant Light died a day before Christmas in 2020 after 11 years of battling lung cancer. But Nicole's family is forever grateful as are many other families that he has helped throughout his career. One of those families wrote in his obituary, "You are a good man, Brant Light. Your efforts changed the ending of a story for us. My dad, brother, and sister are eternally grateful for your tenacity and your resilience in prosecuting the accused person. It wasn't easy. It took everything out of all of us. I don't know the hours or the exact sacrifices you made to be able to get that guilty verdict, but we want you to know that we saw what you did. We felt what you did, and we rest our heads at night in peace because of your efforts." Nicole Waller's body has never been found, which is hard for her family. Her sister, Carmen, says, "I don't have a place to go to talk to her or to spread ashes." She says that every year on Nicole's birthday, May 22nd, she has a cupcake that she puts a candle on, lights the candle, blows it out, and makes one wish. She says that that wish has not changed since Nicole disappeared, and that wish is that Cody or somebody will come forward and let her family know where Nicole is. Nicole's daughter, Ashlyn, has 2 babies of her own. They were born in 2020 and 2022, both beautiful little baby daughters. Nicole's 2 sons were living with their father,